Welcome to the fascinating journey through the history of the Seleucid Empire, one of the most remarkable and expansive realms that emerged in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquests. Following the sudden death of Alexander in 323 BCE, his vast empire, stretching from Greece to the Indus Valley, was left without a clear successor, triggering a series of power struggles known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Amidst this turmoil, Seleucus I Nicator, a brilliant general and strategist, carved out a kingdom that would span from the eastern Mediterranean to the fringes of Central Asia, encompassing a mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions. The Seleucid Empire, at its height, was not merely a political entity, but a complex network of cities, trade routes, military systems, and cultural institutions, reflecting the challenges of ruling an immense, diverse territory in the Hellenistic world. This series will trace the rise, consolidation, expansion, and eventual decline of the Seleucid dynasty, examining its political strategies, military campaigns, economic systems, urban foundations, cultural innovations, and enduring legacies. Through these narratives, we will explore how the Seleucid rulers navigated dynastic rivalries, external threats, and internal revolts, while fostering Hellenistic culture and administration across one of the largest empires of the ancient world. From the ambitious conquests of Seleucus I to the complex diplomacy with neighboring powers, from the flowering of cities like Antioch and Seleucia on the Tigris to the struggles against Parthian expansion and Roman interference, this series presents a detailed portrait of a dynasty that shaped the Near East for over 2 centuries. Join us as we unravel the story of the Seleucid Empire, its triumphs, challenges, and enduring influence, offering insights not only into the history of a powerful dynasty, but also into the broader dynamics of empire, culture, and governance in the Hellenistic era. Part 1 of the Seleucid Empire begins in the turbulent aftermath of Alexander the Great's sudden death in 323 BCE, a moment that shattered the fragile unity of his vast conquests and unleashed one of the most complex power struggles in ancient history. Alexander had forged an empire stretching from Greece and Egypt to Mesopotamia, Persia, and the fringes of India, but he left behind no clear adult heir capable of ruling such an immense domain. In the absence of a single successor, his generals, known to history as the Diadochi, divided authority among themselves while claiming to rule in the name of Alexander's legacy. Out of this chaos emerged Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's most capable officers, whose ambition, military skill, and political adaptability would give birth to the Seleucid Empire, a state that became the eastern pillar of the Hellenistic world. Seleucus initially held the satrapy of Babylon, a position of immense strategic importance, yet his authority was far from secure, as rival generals sought dominance over the same territories. Forced into temporary exile by Antigonus Monophthalmus, Seleucus demonstrated patience rather than desperation, aligning himself with Ptolemy of Egypt and waiting for the right moment to reclaim his power. That moment arrived in 312 BCE, when Seleucus returned to Babylon with a small force and re-established control, an event later regarded as the foundation date of the Seleucid Empire and the beginning of the Seleucid era, used for centuries across the Near East. From Babylon, Seleucus embarked on a series of campaigns that were as much about restoration as conquest, aiming to reclaim the eastern provinces once ruled by Alexander, including Media, Persis, and the distant regions of Bactria and Sogdiana. These territories were not empty lands, but ancient centers of civilization with deep-rooted administrative traditions, and Seleucus understood that ruling them required more than military victory. It demanded accommodation with local elites and respect for established systems of governance. Unlike some of his rivals who focused primarily on the Mediterranean world, Seleucus looked eastward, envisioning an empire that would unite Greek and Near Eastern traditions under a single political framework. His campaigns against Antigonus culminated in the decisive Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, where the coalition of Seleucus, Lysimachus, and others crushed Antigonus's forces, reshaping the map of the Hellenistic world. As a result of this victory, Seleucus gained vast territories in Syria and Anatolia, including control over key trade routes linking the Aegean to Mesopotamia. It was at this point that the Seleucid Empire truly emerged as a great power, rivaling the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedon. To consolidate his rule, Seleucus founded a series of cities, the most famous of which was Antioch on the Orontes, named after his father and destined to become one of the greatest urban centers of the ancient world. These cities were not merely military colonies, but instruments of cultural policy, designed to spread Hellenistic language, art, and political institutions while serving as administrative hubs that bound the empire together. Yet the Seleucid state was never a simple Greek transplant onto Asian soil. It was a hybrid creation that blended Macedonian royal ideology with Persian imperial practices, a synthesis that allowed it to govern a population of immense ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity. Seleucus adopted the title of king in the tradition of Alexander, but also embraced elements of Near Eastern kingship, presenting himself as a legitimate successor to earlier rulers, such as the Achaemenid Persian kings. This dual identity was reflected in the empire's administrative structure, which retained the satrapal system while placing Macedonian and Greek officials alongside local authorities, ensuring continuity while asserting royal control. The vast distances of the Seleucid realm posed constant challenges, as communication between the western capital regions in Syria and the eastern provinces could take months, making local autonomy both necessary and dangerous. To manage this, Seleucus relied on loyal family members and trusted generals, yet even this strategy carried risks, as powerful governors could become semi-independent if central authority weakened. One of the most remarkable aspects of Seleucus's reign was his eastern expedition beyond the Iranian plateau, where he confronted Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Mauryan Empire in India. Rather than pursuing a costly war, Seleucus chose diplomacy, ceding some eastern territories in exchange for 500 war elephants, which would later play a decisive role in Hellenistic warfare, including at Ipsus. This pragmatic decision demonstrated Seleucus's understanding of imperial sustainability, recognizing that holding distant lands without secure lines of control could weaken rather than strengthen his state. The Seleucid Empire thus took shape as a transcontinental power rooted in compromise as much as conquest, balancing ambition with realism. As Seleucus aged, he sought to secure the succession, appointing his son Antiochus I as co-ruler and entrusting him with responsibilities in the eastern provinces, a move intended to ensure continuity and stability. However, the very scale of the empire meant that succession would always be a delicate matter, with rival claims and regional loyalties threatening unity. Seleucus's assassination in 281 BCE, shortly after defeating Lysimachus and on the brink of claiming Macedonia itself, marked the end of the empire's founding phase, but not its ambitions. His death underscored a recurring theme in Seleucid history: the tension between extraordinary potential and persistent vulnerability. The empire he created was one of the largest in the Hellenistic world, rich in resources and cultural vitality, yet perpetually challenged by internal divisions, external rivals, and the sheer difficulty of governing such a vast and varied territory. Part 1 of the Seleucid story, therefore, is not merely the tale of a dynasty's rise, but a study in the complexities of imperial inheritance, showing how Alexander's dream of a unified world was transformed into new political realities, shaped by pragmatism, adaptation, and relentless struggle. Part 2 of the Seleucid Empire narrative unfolds in the era following the death of Seleucus I Nicator, a period marked by both consolidation and strain, as his successors attempted to preserve the immense realm he had carved from Alexander's legacy. Antiochus I inherited not only a vast territory stretching from the Aegean coast to the Iranian plateau, but also the daunting responsibility of maintaining unity across regions with deep-rooted identities and long traditions of autonomy. Unlike his father, whose authority had been forged through constant warfare and personal charisma, Antiochus ruled in a world where the initial shock of conquest had faded, and local elites were increasingly assertive. His reign was characterized by defensive warfare and administrative stabilization, rather than dramatic expansion, as he faced renewed pressure from the Ptolemaic kingdom in Syria and rising unrest in Anatolia. The First Syrian War revealed the fragile balance of power between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, a rivalry that would dominate Eastern Mediterranean politics for more than a century, as both dynasties claimed legitimacy over the same territories and sought control of vital trade routes. Antiochus's response combined military resistance with symbolic gestures, such as promoting ruler cults and emphasizing dynastic continuity, to reinforce loyalty among Greek cities while reassuring Near Eastern populations that traditional religious practices would be respected. Yet the eastern provinces posed an even greater challenge, as nomadic incursions and local rebellions tested the limits of central authority, forcing Antiochus to rely heavily on satraps and regional commanders whose loyalty was not always guaranteed. His defeat by the Galatians in Anatolia and subsequent victory at the so-called Battle of the Elephants became emblematic of the Seleucid approach to crisis, using military innovation and spectacle to restore confidence without fundamentally resolving the structural vulnerabilities of the empire. When Antiochus I died in 261 BCE, the Seleucid state remained intact, but clearly under pressure, a condition that would define the reign of his successor Antiochus II Theos. Antiochus II inherited a kingdom beset by renewed conflict with Egypt during the Second Syrian War, a struggle that underscored the interconnected nature of Hellenistic politics, where battles in Syria, Anatolia, and the Aegean could shape the fate of distant provinces. Antiochus II achieved notable successes against the Ptolemies, regaining key coastal cities and asserting Seleucid influence across Asia Minor, yet these victories came at the cost of political compromise. His marriage to Berenice, the daughter of Ptolemy II, was intended to secure peace, but instead planted the seeds of dynastic catastrophe, as it undermined the position of his first wife, Laodice, and created rival claims to the throne. This decision revealed a recurring dilemma in Seleucid governance, where short-term diplomatic gains often conflicted with long-term stability. While Antiochus II focused on the Western Front, the eastern provinces drifted further from direct control, allowing local dynasties and governors to accumulate power. The emergence of the Parni in Parthia and the growing autonomy of Bactria were early signs that the Seleucid grip on the far eastern territories was weakening, even as the empire continued to project an image of strength and prosperity. Antiochus II's death in 246 BCE triggered one of the most destructive succession crises in Seleucid history, as Laodice arranged for her son Seleucus II Callinicus to be proclaimed king, while Berenice claimed the throne for her infant son, backed by Ptolemaic intervention. The resulting Third Syrian War, also known as the Laodicean War, devastated the heartlands of the Seleucid Empire, with Ptolemaic forces advancing deep into Syria and Mesopotamia, capturing key cities and exposing the vulnerability of Seleucid defenses. Although Seleucus II eventually retained the throne, his authority was severely compromised, and the empire emerged from the conflict exhausted and fragmented. Seleucus II faced the near-impossible task of restoring order while confronting rebellions in Asia Minor and the accelerating secession of eastern regions. His brother Antiochus Hierax openly rebelled, carving out a rival kingdom in Anatolia with the support of local powers, a conflict that drained Seleucid resources and shattered any remaining illusion of dynastic unity. Meanwhile, in the east, the satrap of Bactria declared independence, founding the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, while Parthia slipped beyond Seleucid control under the leadership of the Arsacid dynasty. These losses were not merely territorial but symbolic, signaling the irreversible transformation of the Seleucid Empire from a transcontinental superpower into a more regional state centered on Syria and Mesopotamia. Despite these setbacks, Seleucus II struggled on, attempting to reassert control through military campaigns that achieved limited success, but failed to reverse the broader trend of decentralization. His reign illustrated the structural weaknesses inherent in the Seleucid system, where the combination of vast distances, diverse populations, and dynastic rivalries made sustained centralization extraordinarily difficult. When Seleucus II died in 225 BCE, the empire he passed on to his son Seleucus III was a shadow of its former self, yet it still retained immense resources and the potential for revival. Seleucus III's short and troubled reign, cut short by assassination, highlighted the persistent instability at the heart of the dynasty, but it also paved the way for one of the most significant figures in Seleucid history, Antiochus III, later known as the Great. Part 2 thus captures a critical transitional phase in Seleucid history, an era in which the empire moved from the confident consolidation of its founder's vision to a period of fragmentation and crisis, revealing both the resilience and the fragility of a state born from Alexander's world-shattering conquests, and sustained by a delicate balance of power, diplomacy, and cultural integration. Part 3 of the Seleucid Empire story centers on the dramatic reign of Antiochus III, later remembered as Antiochus the Great, whose long rule from 223 to 187 BCE represented the last genuine attempt to restore the Seleucid state to the imperial scale envisioned by its founder. When Antiochus III ascended the throne, he inherited an empire fractured by decades of internal rebellion, dynastic conflict, and territorial loss, yet not devoid of strength. The core lands of Syria and Mesopotamia remained economically vibrant, their cities still hubs of trade, learning, and administrative expertise, while the Seleucid royal ideology continued to command loyalty among Greek settlers and many local elites. Antiochus, young but ambitious, quickly demonstrated that he intended to reverse the decline by reasserting royal authority across the realm, beginning with the suppression of internal revolts and the restoration of discipline within the army. Early in his reign, he faced the rebellion of the powerful satrap Malan in Media, whose bid for independence threatened to sever the eastern provinces permanently from Seleucid control. Antiochus's decisive response, personally leading his forces eastward and crushing the revolt, sent a clear message that the era of unchecked satrapal autonomy was over, at least temporarily. This victory allowed Antiochus to present himself as a restorer of order, a king capable of commanding loyalty through action rather than mere lineage. With internal stability partially restored, Antiochus turned his attention to the long-standing rivalry with the Ptolemaic kingdom, launching what would become the Fourth Syrian War. The conflict revealed both the strengths and limitations of the rejuvenated Seleucid army, as Antiochus achieved a major victory at the Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE, but ultimately failed to secure lasting control over Syria due to strategic miscalculations and the resilience of Ptolemaic defenses. The defeat at Raphia, though not catastrophic, forced Antiochus to reconsider his priorities, prompting a strategic shift that would define the middle years of his reign. Rather than continue costly wars in the west, he embarked on a grand eastern expedition, the Anabasis, aimed at reclaiming the provinces that had slipped from Seleucid authority in previous generations. Marching through Media, Parthia, and Bactria, Antiochus sought not only to reassert military control, but also to renegotiate the relationship between the crown and regional powers. In Parthia, he compelled the Arsacid ruler to acknowledge Seleucid overlordship, while in Bactria, he accepted a compromise that recognized local kingship in exchange for nominal allegiance. These arrangements reflected a pragmatic understanding that direct rule over distant territories was neither feasible nor necessary for imperial revival. Antiochus's eastern campaign restored prestige to the Seleucid monarchy and reopened trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with Central Asia, reinforcing the empire's economic foundations. Upon his return west, Antiochus capitalized on Ptolemaic weakness following internal unrest in Egypt, launching the Fifth Syrian War and achieving a decisive victory at the Battle of Panium in 200 BCE, which finally brought Syria and Judea under Seleucid control. This triumph marked the high point of Antiochus's power, as the Seleucid Empire once again appeared as the dominant force in the Near East. Antiochus presented himself as a universal monarch, adopting grand titles and emphasizing his role as a benefactor to cities and sanctuaries, while continuing the tradition of founding and supporting urban centers that blended Greek and local cultures. Yet the restoration achieved by Antiochus III carried within it the seeds of future conflict, particularly in his growing involvement in the affairs of the Greek world. Encouraged by exiled Greek factions and emboldened by his successes, Antiochus intervened in Asia Minor and Greece, bringing him into direct confrontation with a rising power that would ultimately determine the fate of the Seleucid Empire, Rome. The Roman Republic, having emerged victorious from its struggles with Carthage, now asserted itself as the arbiter of Mediterranean politics, viewing Antiochus's actions as a threat to its interests and allies. The resulting war exposed the limitations of Seleucid power when faced with Rome's disciplined legions and strategic coherence. Despite initial successes, Antiochus suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE, a loss that shattered the illusion of Seleucid invincibility and forced him to accept the humiliating Treaty of Apamea. Under its terms, Antiochus was compelled to surrender most of his territories in Asia Minor, pay a massive indemnity, and drastically reduce his military capabilities, effectively ending Seleucid ambitions in the Western Mediterranean. The consequences of Magnesia reverberated throughout the empire, undermining royal authority and encouraging renewed challenges from both external rivals and internal factions. Antiochus's final years were marked by financial strain and growing unrest, culminating in his death in 187 BCE during an ill-fated attempt to plunder a temple to finance his obligations to Rome. His reign, though ultimately ending in failure, represented the last moment when the Seleucid Empire stood on the threshold of renewed greatness. Part 3 thus portrays Antiochus III as a complex figure, a visionary reformer and tireless campaigner whose achievements temporarily reversed decades of decline, but whose confrontation with Rome revealed the changing balance of power in the ancient world, setting the stage for the final, irreversible contraction of the empire in the generations to come. Part 4 of the Seleucid Empire narrative traces the long and painful aftermath of Antiochus III's defeat and death, an era defined by contraction, internal conflict, and the relentless erosion of royal authority as the empire struggled to survive in a world increasingly dominated by Rome and powerful regional rivals. When Antiochus III died in 187 BCE, the Seleucid state was burdened by the harsh terms of the Treaty of Apamea, which stripped it of most of its territories in Asia Minor, imposed a crushing financial indemnity, and limited its military capacity, leaving the empire strategically exposed and economically strained. His son and successor, Seleucus IV Philopator, inherited not a resurgent empire but a weakened kingdom forced to prioritize survival over ambition. Seleucus IV focused on maintaining stability within Syria and Mesopotamia, attempting to meet Rome's demands while preserving the loyalty of cities and elites who had grown accustomed to royal patronage. His reign was comparatively peaceful in terms of external warfare, yet this apparent calm masked deep internal tensions, as heavy taxation and fiscal reforms bred resentment among both Greek cities and local populations. The necessity of extracting wealth to pay Rome led to unpopular measures, including interference in temple treasuries, actions that undermined the Seleucid image as protectors of traditional religious institutions. Seleucus IV's assassination in 175 BCE abruptly ended this fragile stability and ushered in one of the most controversial reigns in Seleucid history, that of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus IV was a ruler of extraordinary energy and ambition, determined to restore the prestige of the monarchy despite the constraints imposed by Rome. He embraced an assertive form of kingship, projecting himself as a divine benefactor and cultural unifier, while launching bold military and administrative initiatives aimed at reasserting Seleucid authority. His campaigns against Egypt during the Sixth Syrian War demonstrated both his military skill and the limits of Seleucid independence, as Roman intervention ultimately forced him to withdraw, dramatically illustrating the new balance of power in the Mediterranean. Antiochus IV's domestic policies, particularly his approach to cultural integration, proved far more destabilizing than his foreign ventures. In his efforts to strengthen royal control and promote Hellenistic norms, he interfered aggressively in the internal affairs of Judea, supporting a faction that favored rapid Hellenization and undermining traditional religious practices. These actions sparked the Maccabean Revolt, a prolonged and bitter uprising that drained Seleucid resources and exposed the dangers of heavy-handed cultural policies in a diverse empire. The revolt was not merely a religious conflict, but a broader challenge to Seleucid authority, revealing how far the empire's ability to command loyalty had declined. Antiochus IV's sudden death in 164 BCE left the empire in a state of confusion. As a child king, Antiochus V. Eupator was placed on the throne under the regency of powerful courtiers and generals. This period was marked by intense factionalism, as rival claimants and regents vied for control, inviting intervention from both Rome and neighboring states. The internal chaos weakened the Seleucid position further, allowing the Ptolemies to regain influence in the south and enabling the Parthians to advance steadily from the east. The Parthian threat, once a distant concern, now became an existential danger, as the Arsacid kings seized Media and threatened Mesopotamia, regions that had formed the economic backbone of the Seleucid state since its foundation. Attempts by later Seleucid rulers to reverse this tide were sporadic and largely unsuccessful, hampered by limited resources and constant internal dissent. Demetrius Isoter, who seized power with Roman acquiescence, briefly restored a measure of order through military competence and administrative reform, yet his reign was undermined by renewed revolts and the growing strength of Parthia. Subsequent kings faced an almost impossible situation, ruling a shrinking realm while confronting rival claimants supported by foreign powers, including Rome, Egypt, and local dynasts. The Seleucid monarchy gradually lost its character as a universal Hellenistic empire and became increasingly confined to Syria, its authority contested even within its remaining core territories. Cities that had once been pillars of royal power began to act independently, negotiating directly with Rome or neighboring kings to secure their own survival. By the 1st century BCE, the Seleucid state was a shadow of its former self, plagued by incessant civil wars and incapable of mounting a unified response to external threats. The final blow came with the decisive expansion of Parthian power into Syria and the growing intervention of Rome in Near Eastern affairs. In 64 BCE, the Roman general Pompey formally dissolved what remained of the Seleucid kingdom, transforming Syria into a Roman province and bringing an end to nearly 2.5 centuries of Seleucid rule. Part 4 thus captures the tragic final chapters of the Seleucid story, illustrating how an empire born from Alexander's dream and sustained by remarkable adaptability ultimately succumbed to the combined pressures of overextension, internal division, cultural conflict, and the rise of new imperial powers, leaving behind a legacy that would continue to shape the political and cultural landscape of the Near East long after its fall. Part 5 of the Seleucid Empire narrative moves beyond the political collapse to explore the deeper legacy of the Seleucid world, examining how an empire that ultimately failed as a political entity nonetheless reshaped the cultural, economic, and intellectual landscape of the Near East in ways that endured long after its fall. Even as Seleucid kings lost territory and authority during the final centuries of the dynasty, the structures they had built continued to function, adapt, and influence successor states, revealing that the true significance of the Seleucid Empire lay not only in its wars and rulers, but in its role as a bridge between civilizations. At the heart of this legacy was the Seleucid city, a uniquely powerful instrument of Hellenistic transformation. Cities such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Apamea, and Laodicea were not simply administrative centers. They were living laboratories of cultural fusion where Greek political institutions, language, and artistic forms interacted continuously with older Near Eastern traditions. These cities introduced councils, assemblies, gymnasia, and theaters into regions where urban life had previously followed very different patterns. Yet they also absorbed local religious practices, architectural styles, and social hierarchies. The result was not the replacement of indigenous cultures, but the emergence of new hybrid identities that combined Greek and Eastern elements into forms that were both dynamic and resilient. Greek became the dominant language of administration and high culture across much of the Seleucid realm, facilitating communication over vast distances and integrating diverse populations into a shared political vocabulary. Yet Aramaic, Persian, and other local languages continued to thrive in daily life, commerce, and religious practice. This multilingual environment fostered intellectual exchange on an unprecedented scale, as ideas, myths, and technologies traveled along the empire's roads and trade routes. The Seleucid economy was another area where the empire's impact proved lasting. By controlling key corridors between the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, Iran, and Central Asia, the Seleucids helped stabilize and expand long-distance trade networks that connected the Greek world with India and beyond. Seleucid coinage, bearing the images of kings and gods, circulated widely, standardizing economic exchange and reinforcing royal authority while also spreading Hellenistic iconography deep into Asia. Agricultural policies, including the development of irrigation systems in Mesopotamia and Syria, supported population growth and urbanization, creating a surplus that sustained both local markets and international trade. Even after the political authority of the Seleucid kings waned, these economic systems continued to operate, later benefiting Parthian and Roman rulers who inherited the infrastructure without having to build it anew. Religiously, the Seleucid world was characterized by remarkable diversity and adaptability. Rather than enforcing a single imperial cult at the expense of local traditions, Seleucid rulers generally supported a wide range of religious practices, presenting themselves as benefactors of temples and sanctuaries across the empire. Greek gods were often identified with local deities, creating syncretic forms of worship that allowed different communities to find meaning within a shared symbolic framework. This flexibility helped maintain stability in a culturally complex realm and laid the groundwork for later religious developments, including the spread of mystery cults and, eventually, the early diffusion of Christianity within the former Seleucid territories. The intellectual life of the Seleucid Empire, though less famous than that of Ptolemaic Alexandria, was nonetheless vibrant and influential. Antioch became a major center of learning, attracting philosophers, scientists, and artists who contributed to the broader Hellenistic intellectual tradition. Advances in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and geography flowed along Seleucid networks, blending Greek theoretical approaches with the empirical knowledge of Babylonian and Persian scholars. This synthesis enriched ancient science and preserved traditions that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political instability. The Seleucid approach to governance also left a complex legacy. By combining Macedonian royal ideology with Achaemenid administrative practices, the Seleucids created a model of imperial rule that emphasized flexibility and local cooperation. Satrapies, city privileges, and negotiated autonomy allowed the empire to function despite its immense size and diversity, influencing later imperial systems, particularly those of the Parthians and Romans, who adopted similar strategies when ruling the same regions. Even the weaknesses of the Seleucid system, such as its reliance on powerful regional elites and dynastic legitimacy, provided lessons that later empires would heed or exploit. Perhaps most striking is the way the Seleucid legacy persisted through transformation rather than continuity. When Rome absorbed Syria and Parthia dominated the East, they did not erase the Seleucid world but reshaped it, preserving cities, trade routes, and cultural institutions that continued to define life in the Near East. Antioch remained one of the greatest cities of the Roman Empire, a center of commerce, culture, and early Christian thought, while Seleucia and other foundations continued to thrive under new rulers. The memory of the Seleucid kings faded, but the structures they had built endured, influencing the political imagination of later generations who looked back to the Hellenistic age as a time of cosmopolitan exchange and creative synthesis. In this sense, the Seleucid Empire stands as a reminder that historical significance cannot be measured solely by political survival. Though the dynasty ultimately failed to maintain unity and sovereignty, it succeeded in creating a world where cultures met, interacted, and transformed one another on a vast scale. Part 5 thus concludes the Seleucid story by emphasizing its enduring impact, portraying the empire not merely as a fallen power, but as a crucial chapter in the long history of cultural connection between East and West, a legacy that continued to shape the ancient world long after the Seleucid kings themselves had passed into history. Part 6 of the Seleucid Empire narrative turns inward to examine the lived realities, institutions, and social dynamics that sustain the empire across centuries of upheaval, revealing how ordinary life, governance, and identity functioned within one of the most diverse political systems of the ancient world. Beneath the dramatic rise and fall of kings and battles lay a complex social fabric in which Greeks, Macedonians, Persians, Babylonians, Syrians, Jews, Iranians, and many other peoples coexisted, negotiated power, and adapted to changing circumstances. Daily life in the Seleucid realm varied enormously by region, yet shared certain unifying features shaped by imperial administration and Hellenistic culture. In major cities, urban life revolved around marketplaces, temples, baths, theaters, and gymnasia, where Greek civic ideals of citizenship and public participation mixed with older Near Eastern communal traditions. Greek settlers often enjoyed privileged legal status, living in planned neighborhoods and participating in city councils, while local populations maintained traditional family structures, religious customs, and economic practices, creating layered societies rather than rigidly segregated ones. Rural life, which sustained the empire's economic base, remained deeply rooted in long-established agricultural rhythms, particularly in Mesopotamia and Syria, where irrigation networks supported large populations and tied villages to regional markets. The Seleucid state depended heavily on these rural producers, extracting taxes in kind and coin while largely leaving local customs intact, a pragmatic approach that minimized resistance and ensured continuity. Administration in the Seleucid Empire reflected this balance between central authority and local autonomy. At the top stood the king, whose legitimacy rested on military success, dynastic lineage, and the ability to act as a benefactor to cities and sanctuaries. Royal decrees, issued in Greek but often translated into local languages, emphasized justice, generosity, and protection of traditional rights, reinforcing the image of the king as a guardian of order. Beneath the monarch, the satrapal system inherited from the Achaemenids remained the backbone of provincial governance, though adapted to Hellenistic norms. Satraps collected taxes, maintained security, and administered justice, yet they operated within a web of royal inspectors, military commanders, and city authorities designed to prevent the concentration of too much power in any single hand. Despite these safeguards, the system's dependence on personal loyalty made it vulnerable to rebellion, especially during weak reigns, highlighting the constant tension between efficiency and control. Law in the Seleucid world was similarly pluralistic, with Greek cities governed by their own civic codes, while local communities followed customary laws rooted in ancient traditions. Royal courts intervened primarily in cases involving imperial interests, disputes between cities, or challenges to royal authority, allowing legal diversity to coexist under a single political framework. The Seleucid military was another defining institution, both a source of power and a persistent burden on the state. Built initially on Macedonian phalanxes and cavalry, the army evolved to incorporate a wide range of troops drawn from across the empire, including Iranian horsemen, Anatolian infantry, and mercenaries from the Greek world. War elephants, inherited from Seleucus I's Eastern diplomacy, remained symbols of royal might even as their tactical value declined. Maintaining such a diverse force required vast resources and careful management, tying the army closely to the empire's fiscal health and political stability. soldiers often settled in military colonies, receiving land in exchange for service, a practice that reinforced loyalty while spreading Hellenistic culture into the countryside. Yet this militarization of settlement also contributed to social tensions, as local populations navigated the presence of armed settlers with privileged status. Women in the Seleucid Empire occupied roles that, while constrained by patriarchal norms, were nevertheless significant in both public and private spheres. Royal women, in particular, wielded considerable influence through marriage alliances, regencies, and patronage, shaping succession politics and diplomatic relationships. Queens and princesses founded cities, sponsored temples, and appeared on coinage, projecting images of dynastic continuity and divine favor. Beyond the court, women participated actively in economic life as landowners, merchants, and benefactors, especially in urban contexts where Greek legal traditions allowed greater property rights than in many earlier systems. Religious life offered additional avenues for female authority, as priestesses and devotees played central roles in local cults that blended Greek and indigenous elements. Art and architecture in the Seleucid world reflected the empire's hybrid identity, combining Hellenistic forms with regional styles to create distinctive expressions of power and belief. Monumental architecture in cities such as Antioch and Seleucia showcased Greek columns, theaters, and public spaces, yet incorporated local motifs and building techniques. Sculpture, coinage, and decorative arts portrayed kings in idealized Greek forms while invoking Near Eastern symbols of legitimacy, reinforcing the dual nature of Seleucid rule. These artistic choices were not merely aesthetic, but deeply political, communicating messages of continuity, authority, and cultural inclusivity to diverse audiences. Education and intellectual life further reinforced the empire's integrative character. Greek paideia, centered on rhetoric, philosophy, and literature, spread through urban institutions, shaping elite identities across the realm. At the same time, older scholarly traditions, particularly in Babylon, preserved and advanced knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, contributing to a shared intellectual heritage that transcended ethnic boundaries. This coexistence of traditions created an environment where knowledge could circulate freely, influencing later Roman and Islamic scholarship long after the Seleucid state had vanished. Memory and identity in the Seleucid Empire were constantly renegotiated, as communities interpreted the imperial experience through their own histories and values. For Greek settlers, the Seleucid world represented the extension of Hellenic civilization into Asia, a continuation of Alexander's vision. For local populations, it was another chapter in a long sequence of empires, evaluated less by ideology than by its ability to maintain order and prosperity. This multiplicity of perspectives explains both the resilience and fragility of the Seleucid system, which thrived when it accommodated diversity, but faltered when it attempted uniformity. Part 6 thus reveals the Seleucid Empire not merely as a political structure, but as a lived world shaped by everyday interactions, institutional compromises, and cultural creativity, offering a deeper understanding of how Alexander's inheritance functioned on the ground, and why its influence outlasted the dynasty that gave it form. Part 7 of the Seleucid Empire narrative turns to the question of memory, historiography, and rediscovery, exploring how the Seleucid world was remembered, misunderstood, and gradually reconstructed by later generations, and how modern scholarship has transformed our understanding of this vast, but often overshadowed Hellenistic empire. In antiquity, the Seleucids were rarely remembered on their own terms. Instead, their story was filtered through the perspectives of rivals and successors who had strong incentives to diminish their achievements. Roman historians, writing from the vantage point of imperial triumph, portrayed the Seleucid kings largely as failed monarchs whose defeat confirmed Rome's destiny as the ruler of the Mediterranean world. Greek authors often focused on dramatic personalities and moral lessons, emphasizing court intrigue, decadence, and decline, rather than the administrative sophistication and cultural integration that sustained the empire for centuries. Jewish sources, particularly those shaped by the trauma of the Maccabean revolt, remembered the Seleucids primarily through the actions of Antiochus IV, casting the dynasty as oppressors and framing resistance as a sacred struggle. Eastern traditions, meanwhile, absorbed the Seleucid period into longer narratives of imperial succession, viewing it as an interlude between Achaemenid and Parthian rule rather than a defining era in its own right. These fragmented and often hostile memories contributed to a historical imbalance in which the Seleucid Empire appeared as a secondary power, less coherent and less significant than its Ptolemaic or Roman counterparts. For centuries, this perception shaped both popular and scholarly views, leaving the Seleucids in the shadows of Alexander and Rome. The rediscovery of the Seleucid world began slowly, driven not by grand historical narratives, but by archaeology, numismatics, and the patient work of deciphering inscriptions. Excavations at sites such as Seleucia on the Tigris, Antioch, Dur Europos, and Ai Khanum revealed cities that contradicted the image of decay and chaos, instead pointing to vibrant urban life, sophisticated planning, and long-term stability. Coins bearing the portraits and titles of Seleucid kings provided a chronological framework that clarified succession and territorial control, while also revealing how royal imagery evolved to address changing political realities. Inscriptions, often bilingual or trilingual, shed light on administrative practices, civic privileges, and the relationship between kings and cities, demonstrating a level of institutional continuity that challenged older narratives of constant decline. Together, these sources allowed historians to reconstruct the Seleucid Empire not as a failed experiment, but as a functioning imperial system adapted to extraordinary diversity. Modern historiography has increasingly emphasized the Seleucid Empire's role as a connective power, one that linked the Mediterranean to Central Asia and facilitated the movement of people, goods, and ideas across immense distances. Rather than viewing the loss of Eastern territories as evidence of weakness, scholars now interpret it as part of a broader process of regionalization in which local dynasties emerged within a shared Hellenistic framework. The Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms, once seen as breakaway states, are now understood as heirs to Seleucid institutions, extending Hellenistic culture into South Asia and contributing to cross-cultural exchange on a global scale. Similarly, the rise of Parthia is no longer seen simply as the destruction of Seleucid power, but as a transformation of imperial governance, one that preserved cities, trade routes, and administrative practices established under Seleucid rule. This shift in perspective has repositioned the Seleucid Empire as a central actor in the history of Eurasia, a bridge rather than a barrier between civilizations. Comparative studies have further enriched this reassessment by placing the Seleucid experience alongside that of other empires, ancient and modern. When compared with the Achaemenid Persians, the Seleucids appear less centralized but more flexible, relying on negotiated authority rather than rigid hierarchy. In contrast to Rome, they lacked a unified legal system and standing bureaucracy, yet their tolerance for local autonomy allowed them to govern culturally complex regions with relatively limited coercion. These comparisons highlight the distinctive character of Seleucid imperialism, which prioritized adaptability and cultural synthesis over uniformity. They also help explain both the empire's longevity and its vulnerabilities, as the same flexibility that enabled survival could also undermine cohesion during periods of dynastic weakness. The Seleucid experience thus offers valuable insights into the challenges of ruling diverse populations, insights that resonate far beyond antiquity. Cultural memory of the Seleucid world has also evolved through literature, art, and modern popular history, though often in fragmented form. Antioch, once the jewel of the Seleucid crown, became a symbol of cosmopolitan urban life in Roman and later Christian traditions, its Seleucid origins gradually obscured by new layers of meaning. Stories of Hellenistic kings, court dramas, and Eastern campaigns inspired later writers and artists, even when the Seleucid name itself faded from view. In recent decades, renewed interest in globalization and cross-cultural exchange has brought the Seleucid Empire back into focus, as scholars and audiences alike seek historical examples of interconnected worlds that challenge simplistic East, East-West divisions. This renewed attention has highlighted the empire's relevance to contemporary discussions about identity, cultural hybridity, and the dynamics of power in multicultural societies. At the same time, the study of the Seleucid Empire faces ongoing challenges, shaped by modern politics and the uneven preservation of archaeological sites. Many key regions of the former empire lie in areas affected by conflict and instability, limiting access for researchers and threatening irreplaceable heritage. Despite these obstacles, advances in technology, including satellite imagery, digital mapping, and improved methods of material analysis, continue to expand our understanding of Seleucid landscapes and networks. Each new discovery has the potential to reshape long-held assumptions, reminding us that the history of the Seleucid Empire is still being written. Part 7 therefore emphasizes that the Seleucid story does not end with political collapse, but continues through memory, scholarship, and reinterpretation. By tracing how the empire was remembered, forgotten, and rediscovered, this chapter underscores the importance of perspective in historical judgment and invites a more balanced appreciation of a dynasty that once ruled the heart of the ancient world. The Seleucid Empire emerges not as a footnote to Alexander or Rome, but as a complex and influential experiment in imperial governance, whose legacy continues to inform our understanding of cultural connection, historical continuity, and the enduring human challenge of ruling diversity across vast spaces. Part 8 of the Seleucid Empire narrative explores the empire through the lens of power, legitimacy, and ideology, examining how Seleucid kings attempted to rule a realm born from conquest, yet sustained by belief, symbolism, and carefully constructed images of authority. Unlike modern states grounded in fixed borders and institutions, the Seleucid Empire existed as a personal monarchy, where power flowed outward from the king and depended heavily on perception, ritual, and the ability to convince diverse populations that Seleucid rule was both rightful and beneficial. From its foundation, Seleucid kings presented themselves as heirs not only to Alexander the Great, but also to the ancient imperial traditions of the Near East. This dual inheritance shaped every aspect of Seleucid ideology. On the one hand, kings styled themselves as Macedonian warrior rulers, emphasizing military prowess, victory in battle, and personal courage, virtues deeply rooted in Greek and Macedonian culture. On the other hand, they adopted Near Eastern concepts of kingship that portrayed the ruler as a divinely favored guardian of cosmic order, responsible for justice, fertility, and prosperity. This synthesis allowed Seleucid monarchs to speak simultaneously to Greek settlers, who valued civic freedom and heroic leadership, and to indigenous populations for whom kingship was sacred and hierarchical. Royal titles and epithets played a crucial role in this ideological balancing act. Names such as Soter, Theos, Epiphanes, and Megas were not empty honorifics, but carefully chosen statements about the king's role in the world. To be a savior was to restore order after chaos. To be God manifest was to claim an intimate relationship with the divine. To be great was to assert parity with legendary conquerors of the past. These titles were broadcast through coinage, inscriptions, and public ceremonies, ensuring that even subjects who never saw the king in person encountered his image and authority in their daily lives. Coinage in particular became one of the most powerful tools of Seleucid ideology. Minted across dozens of cities, Seleucid coins circulated widely, carrying standardized portraits of the king that emphasized youth, strength, and divine favor. The use of specific symbols, such as anchors, horns, or radiate crowns, communicated dynastic continuity and supernatural legitimacy, linking the Seleucid ruler to both Alexander and older Near Eastern divine kings. At the same time, local variations in coin imagery allowed cities to express their own identities, reinforcing the sense that Seleucid rule was flexible rather than oppressive. Public ritual further reinforced royal authority. Kings appeared in festivals, sacrifices, and processions, acting as intermediaries between gods and people. They endowed temples, restored sanctuaries, and confirmed priestly privileges, presenting themselves as benefactors rather than conquerors. These actions were not merely acts of piety but strategic investments in loyalty, as religious institutions held immense social and economic influence. By aligning themselves with local cults, Seleucid kings embedded their authority within the spiritual life of their subjects. Yet ideology alone could not sustain the empire without military success, and Seleucid kings understood that legitimacy was inseparable from victory. A king who lost battles risked not only territory, but the belief that the gods favored his rule. This explains the relentless campaigning of Seleucid monarchs, even during periods of internal crisis. Military triumphs were celebrated through monuments, dedications, and new city foundations, transforming conquest into visible proof of divine support. Conversely, defeats often triggered rebellions and challenges to authority, as rivals interpreted failure as a sign that the king had lost his mandate to rule. Succession was one of the greatest ideological vulnerabilities of the Seleucid system. Because legitimacy was personal rather than institutional, the death of a king opened space for competing claims, each backed by different interpretations of dynastic right and divine favor. Queens, regents, and princes all participated in this ideological struggle, using marriage alliances, religious patronage, and public declarations to assert their legitimacy. Civil wars were therefore not merely contests of arms, but battles over meaning, as each faction sought to present itself as the true embodiment of Seleucid kingship. The involvement of foreign powers such as Rome and Egypt in these succession disputes further complicated the ideological landscape, as Seleucid kings increasingly relied on external recognition to bolster their claims, undermining the traditional image of autonomous royal authority. Over time, the ideological foundations of the Seleucid Empire were eroded by structural pressures that no amount of symbolism could fully overcome. The loss of eastern territories weakened the universal claims of Seleucid kingship, while Roman intervention exposed the limits of Seleucid sovereignty in the West. As kings became dependent on mercenaries, foreign allies, and heavy taxation, the image of the benevolent ruler was increasingly difficult to sustain. Cultural policies that had once emphasized inclusion hardened into coercion in certain contexts, most notably in Judea, where attempts to impose uniform practices provoked fierce resistance and permanently damaged Seleucid legitimacy among key populations. Yet even in decline, Seleucid ideology did not vanish. It adapted, fragmenting into regional expressions that outlived the empire itself. In Parthia, Arsacid kings adopted many Seleucid symbols of authority, including Greek language and coinage, blending them with Iranian traditions to legitimize their own rule. In Roman Syria, cities continued to celebrate their Seleucid foundations, maintaining civic institutions and festivals rooted in Hellenistic models. The very success of Seleucid ideological strategies ensured their survival beyond the dynasty, influencing how power was imagined and performed in the Near East for centuries. Part 8 thus reveals the Seleucid Empire as an experiment in imperial legitimacy, one that relied not on uniform domination, but on persuasion, adaptation, and symbolic power. By examining how Seleucid kings constructed and defended their authority, this chapter deepens our understanding of why the empire endured as long as it did despite immense challenges, and why its collapse was gradual rather than sudden. The Seleucid story emerges as a reminder that empires are sustained as much by belief as by force, and that the struggle to rule diversity is ultimately a struggle over meaning, identity, and the right to command allegiance across cultures and generations. Part 9 of the Seleucid Empire narrative focuses on the empire's geopolitical environment and its constant interaction with rival powers, revealing how the Seleucid state was shaped as much by external pressures as by internal dynamics, and how its fate was inseparable from the wider Hellenistic and Near Eastern world. From its very foundation, the Seleucid Empire existed in a competitive landscape where no major power could afford isolation. To the west lay the Mediterranean world, dominated first by rival Hellenistic kingdoms and later by Rome. To the south stood the wealthy and diplomatically agile Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. To the east emerged new Iranian and Central Asian powers, such as Parthia and the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. And to the north, and interior regions existed a mosaic of Anatolian, Armenian, and Arab polities whose loyalties shifted with circumstance. The Seleucid kings ruled not a closed empire but an open arena, where diplomacy, warfare, marriage alliances, and economic competition were constant and unavoidable. The rivalry with the Ptolemies was the most enduring and defining of these external relationships. For over a century, the two dynasties contested control over Syria, Phoenicia, and Palestine, regions whose strategic ports, fertile lands, and trade routes were essential to imperial power. These Syrian wars were not merely military conflicts, but ideological struggles over legitimacy, as both dynasties claimed to be the rightful heirs of Alexander's authority in the eastern Mediterranean. Each war reshaped alliances among Greek cities, local rulers, and mercenary forces, drawing the Seleucid Empire into a continuous cycle of mobilization that strained resources, but also sharpened administrative and military capabilities. Even during periods of peace, espionage, diplomacy, and proxy conflicts ensured that the Seleucid, Ptolemaic rivalry never truly ended, embedding a culture of strategic vigilance into Seleucid governance. To the north and west, the Seleucid relationship with Anatolia and the Aegean world was equally complex. The patchwork of cities, leagues, and kingdoms in Asia Minor required constant negotiation, as Seleucid kings alternated between direct rule, client relationships, and strategic withdrawal. Alliances with city leagues brought prestige and manpower, but also obligations that could entangle the empire in distant disputes. The rise of Pergamon as a regional power, supported at times by Rome, gradually eroded Seleucid influence in Anatolia, transforming former imperial territories into contested borderlands. This shift not only reduced Seleucid revenues, but also exposed the empire to Roman diplomacy, which increasingly positioned itself as the guarantor of freedom for Greek cities, while undermining Seleucid authority through treaties and arbitration rather than outright conquest. Rome's gradual involvement in Seleucid affairs marked a turning point in the empire's geopolitical reality. Unlike earlier rivals, Rome did not seek coexistence within a shared Hellenistic framework, but imposed a new hierarchy of power that left little room for Seleucid independence. Roman demands, hostages, and interventions in succession disputes steadily transformed the Seleucid kings from sovereign rulers into constrained actors operating under external supervision. In the East, the Seleucid Empire faced a different but equally transformative challenge. The rise of Parthia represented not just a military threat, but an alternative imperial model rooted in Iranian traditions and steppe warfare. Parthian expansion was gradual yet relentless, exploiting Seleucid internal conflicts and the difficulty of projecting power across vast distances. Each eastern province lost to Parthia weakened the Seleucid economic base and undermined its claim to universal kingship, shifting the empire's center of gravity westward and intensifying its dependence on Syrian resources. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, though culturally related to the Seleucid world, further demonstrated the limits of imperial cohesion by thriving independently while maintaining Hellenistic institutions. These eastern states were not enemies in the traditional sense, but living reminders that Seleucid authority was no longer essential for political and cultural continuity. Relations with smaller neighboring powers added further layers of complexity. Armenian and Cappadocian rulers alternated between alliance and resistance, using Seleucid weakness to assert autonomy while seeking recognition and legitimacy from the Hellenistic world. Arab tribes along the desert frontiers controlled key trade routes and oases, forcing Seleucid kings to negotiate protection, subsidies, and military cooperation to secure commerce and communication. In the Levant and Mesopotamia, local dynasts and temple authorities wielded significant influence, sometimes acting as stabilizing partners and at other times as focal points of resistance. The Seleucid Empire thus functioned within a dense web of relationships where power was rarely absolute and always contingent. Economic competition also shaped Seleucid geopolitics. Control of trade routes linking the Mediterranean to Arabia, Iran, and Central Asia was a central objective of Seleucid strategy, as these routes generated revenue and reinforced the empire's role as an intermediary between worlds. Ports such as Seleucia and Phoenician cities connected maritime trade with inland networks, while caravan routes through Mesopotamia and Iran facilitated the exchange of spices, textiles, metals, and ideas. Rival powers understood the importance of these networks, and conflicts often revolved around access rather than ideology. As Seleucid control weakened, trade did not cease but shifted under new authorities, illustrating how economic integration outlived political dominance. The cumulative effect of these external pressures was a gradual transformation of the Seleucid Empire's identity. What began as a universal monarchy claiming authority from the Aegean to India became, over time, a regional kingdom struggling to defend its Syrian heartland. This transformation was not sudden, but unfolded through decades of adaptation, compromise, and loss, as Seleucid kings recalibrated their ambitions in response to changing realities. Yet even in contraction, the empire remained deeply embedded in the geopolitical fabric of the ancient world, its actions influencing and responding to developments far beyond its borders. Part 9 thus emphasizes that the Seleucid Empire cannot be understood in isolation. Its history is the story of interaction, of rivalry with Egypt, negotiation with Anatolian cities, confrontation with Rome, and transformation through contact with Eastern powers. By situating the Seleucid experience within this broader geopolitical context, this chapter reveals an empire defined not only by its internal structures, but by its constant engagement with a dynamic and interconnected world, where survival depended as much on diplomacy and adaptation as on armies and kings. Part 10 of the Seleucid Empire narrative brings the long story to a reflective culmination by synthesizing the political, cultural, social, and ideological threads explored in earlier parts, offering a holistic understanding of what the Seleucid Empire ultimately represented within the broader arc of ancient history. At its core, the Seleucid Empire was an audacious attempt to transform the fragmented aftermath of Alexander the Great's conquests into a durable, multi-ethnic, and transregional state, one that could hold together lands stretching from the Mediterranean shores of Syria to the highlands of Iran, and at times, the fringes of Central Asia. Unlike smaller successor kingdoms that could rely on geographic cohesion or cultural homogeneity, the Seleucid realm was defined by scale and diversity, and its rulers were forced to confront challenges that few pre-modern states had ever faced so directly. The empire's long lifespan, spanning nearly 2.5 centuries, was itself a remarkable achievement, made possible not by constant dominance, but by continual adaptation. Seleucid kings rarely ruled uncontested, yet they managed to maintain a recognizable imperial structure through negotiation, compromise, and selective assertion of force. This capacity for adjustment was both the empire's greatest strength and its deepest vulnerability, allowing it to survive repeated crises while also preventing the emergence of rigid institutions capable of outlasting dynastic weakness. From a political perspective, the Seleucid Empire demonstrated the limits of personal monarchy when stretched across immense distances. Authority flowed from the king, and when that authority was embodied by figures of exceptional ability such as Seleucus I or Antiochus III, the empire could expand, stabilize, and even revive after periods of decline. When the throne was occupied by weaker or contested rulers, however, the absence of strong institutional constraints allowed rival claimants, ambitious generals, and regional elites to fracture the state from within. Succession crises became recurring turning points, each one eroding the sense of unity and inevitability that an empire requires to command loyalty. Yet these crises also revealed how deeply Seleucid political culture had penetrated local societies, as contenders for power sought legitimacy not by rejecting the Seleucid system, but by claiming to embody it more authentically than their rivals. Culturally, the Seleucid Empire stands as one of antiquity's most important arenas of interaction between Greek and Near Eastern traditions. Rather than enforcing a single cultural model, Seleucid rule facilitated a process of exchange in which ideas, artistic forms, religious practices, and social institutions flowed in multiple directions. Greek cities flourished across Asia, yet they were transformed by their surroundings, absorbing local customs and beliefs even as they projected Hellenistic norms. Indigenous traditions did not disappear under Seleucid rule, but adapted, finding new expressions within the framework of Hellenistic urban life and imperial patronage. This cultural hybridity was not a byproduct of weakness, but a deliberate strategy, enabling the empire to function across regions with vastly different historical experiences. The endurance of this hybrid culture after the empire's fall testifies to its depth and resilience, as later Roman, Parthian, and even early Islamic societies inherited and reshaped Seleucid foundations. Economically, the Seleucid world exemplified the power of connectivity. By maintaining and expanding networks of trade that linked the Mediterranean with Mesopotamia, Iran, and Central Asia, the Seleucid Empire played a central role in the early history of globalization. Goods, currencies, technologies, and ideas moved along roads, rivers, and caravan routes protected and regulated by imperial authority. Even when political control weakened, these networks continued to operate, demonstrating that the empire's most lasting contribution lay not in territorial possession, but in the creation of systems that facilitated exchange on a continental scale. The Seleucid emphasis on urban development, infrastructure, and standardized coinage created economic patterns that outlived the dynasty and shaped the prosperity of successor states. Ideologically, the Seleucid experiment revealed the complexity of ruling diversity through symbolism and belief. Seleucid kings did not rely solely on coercion, but invested heavily in the performance of legitimacy, presenting themselves as warriors, benefactors, and divinely favored rulers capable of harmonizing different traditions. This ideological flexibility allowed them to speak to multiple audiences at once, yet it also meant that legitimacy was fragile, constantly dependent on success, generosity, and recognition. When military defeat or fiscal pressure undermined these foundations, belief in the king's right to rule could collapse rapidly, triggering cycles of rebellion and fragmentation. The Seleucid experience thus illustrates a fundamental truth of imperial history. Power endures not merely through force, but through the shared acceptance of authority, an acceptance that must be continually renewed. In the final analysis, the fall of the Seleucid Empire was not the result of a single failure, but the cumulative outcome of structural challenges that no Hellenistic monarchy could fully overcome. The rise of Rome introduced a new and uncompromising imperial order that left little room for autonomous great powers in the eastern Mediterranean, while the emergence of Parthia transformed the political landscape of the Iranian world. These external pressures exploited internal vulnerabilities but did not create them, accelerating processes of contraction that were already underway. Yet the end of Seleucid rule did not mark the end of the world it had shaped. Cities, institutions, cultural practices, and economic networks continued to thrive, carrying forward the imprint of Seleucid governance into new historical contexts. Seen in this light, the Seleucid Empire should not be judged primarily by its ultimate collapse, but by the historical space it opened, a space in which East and West were not opposing poles, but interconnected regions engaged in constant dialogue. Part 10 therefore concludes the series by reaffirming the Seleucid Empire's significance as one of antiquity's great experiments in empire building, an ambitious and imperfect inheritance of Alexander's vision that transformed the ancient world in enduring ways. Through its successes and failures alike, the Seleucid story offers profound insight into the possibilities and limits of imperial rule, reminding us that the legacy of an empire is measured not only in the longevity of its political power, but in the lasting patterns of connection, culture, and memory it leaves behind. Part 11 of the Seleucid Empire narrative delves into the empire's enduring influence on the wider Hellenistic world and the Near East, examining the ways in which Seleucid institutions, culture, and networks persisted even after the political authority of the dynasty had collapsed, and exploring the ways in which subsequent societies absorbed, adapted, and reinterpreted Seleucid legacies. Even as the Seleucid kings lost direct control over vast territories, the structures they had created, urban centers, administrative frameworks, trade networks, and cultural institutions, continued to shape the economic and social realities of the region for centuries. Cities such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Laodicea remained thriving centers of commerce, learning, and administration, functioning as hubs that linked local populations with distant regions and served as enduring symbols of Hellenistic urban planning and civic life. These urban centers were more than mere settlements. They were instruments of cultural integration, bringing together Greek settlers, local elites, and diverse communities under shared civic norms while allowing local traditions to persist and adapt. The Seleucid approach to governance, which combined central authority with negotiated autonomy, created a model for subsequent regimes. The Arsacid Parthians, for example, adopted many of the administrative and urban strategies pioneered under Seleucid rule, maintaining satrapal divisions, fostering city-based governance, and continuing the use of Greek as a lingua franca for administration and diplomacy, even as Iranian cultural and political forms were reasserted. The interplay between Greek and local traditions that characterized Seleucid rule thus became a defining feature of the Eastern Iranian world, influencing not only politics, but also art, religion, and intellectual life. Seleucid coinage provides a particularly striking example of this lasting influence. The widespread circulation of standardized coins bearing the images of kings, divine symbols, and inscriptions in Greek had both immediate and long-term effects. Economically, it facilitated trade across disparate regions, providing a stable medium of exchange that outlasted political boundaries. Culturally, the iconography set a template that was adopted and adapted by subsequent rulers, from Parthians to later Roman administrators, demonstrating how visual symbols could transmit authority and legitimacy beyond the life of a single dynasty. Religious policies under the Seleucids also left a durable imprint. While attempts at Hellenization, such as those implemented by Antiochus IV in Judea, provoked resistance and conflict, the broader approach of combining support for Greek cults with respect for local traditions became a model for governance in multicultural societies. Temples, priesthoods, and festivals continued to operate long after Seleucid control waned, and the pattern of integrating local religious institutions into imperial strategy influenced later rulers who governed similarly diverse populations. Intellectual and cultural exchange flourished under Seleucid auspices, particularly in urban centers where Greek, Mesopotamian, and Iranian knowledge intersected. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy benefited from the circulation of scholars and texts, creating a legacy of intellectual synthesis that informed later Hellenistic and Roman scholarship. The empire's commitment to infrastructure, roads, bridges, irrigation, and urban planning further facilitated this exchange, knitting together a vast territory in ways that allowed knowledge, goods, and ideas to circulate despite political fragmentation. Economically, the Seleucid emphasis on connectivity and trade created networks that persisted even in the absence of central authority. Caravans, ports, and markets established or maintained under Seleucid rule became foundations upon which later regimes, including Parthian and Roman administrations, built their own economic systems. The continuity of trade and urban prosperity underscored the empire's lasting material influence, demonstrating that even when political structures fail, the economic and social frameworks they establish can endure and shape the trajectory of subsequent history. Military and strategic practices pioneered under Seleucid rule also influenced successor states. The integration of diverse troops, the use of combined arms including elephants and cavalry, and the deployment of fortified cities as regional centers of control provided models that informed Parthian and even early Roman strategies in the Near East. These military innovations, though ultimately insufficient to prevent Seleucid decline, were not lost, but became part of a broader tactical repertoire that shaped warfare in the region for generations. The memory of the Seleucid Empire in literature, historiography, and cultural consciousness also contributed to its lasting impact. Even when the dynasty itself faded from power, stories of its kings, campaigns, and urban foundations persisted in Greek, Roman, and Jewish narratives. Antiochus IV, despite his controversial policies, became a figure whose actions were recorded, debated, and dramatized, influencing religious, political, and cultural thought. Such memory shaped the way subsequent generations interpreted authority, legitimacy, and the risks of imposing cultural uniformity across diverse populations. Modern scholarship has continued this process of reinterpretation, highlighting the Seleucid Empire as a bridge between the Greek world and the cultures of the Near East, emphasizing its achievements in administration, cultural synthesis, and economic integration. Archaeological discoveries, numismatic studies, and epigraphic research have revealed the scale and sophistication of Seleucid cities, the intricacy of their bureaucracies, and the richness of their artistic and intellectual life. These findings underscore the complexity of an empire often overshadowed by Rome and the Ptolemies, demonstrating that Seleucid influence extended far beyond the lifespan of the dynasty itself. Part 11 thus frames the Seleucid Empire not only as a historical political entity, but as a formative cultural, economic, and intellectual force whose structures, institutions, and ideas continued to shape the Near East long after its fall. By tracing the enduring effects of Seleucid urbanism, governance, trade, religion, and scholarship, this chapter illuminates the ways in which the empire's achievements transcended its dynastic collapse, leaving an indelible mark on subsequent civilizations, and reminding us that the legacy of an empire is measured as much by what it creates and transmits as by the duration of its political power. The Seleucid story, therefore, is not one of simple decline, but of complex transformation, demonstrating the resilience of cultural and institutional innovation in the face of political adversity and the enduring capacity of human societies to preserve and adapt the foundations laid by ambitious and visionary rulers. Part 12 of the Seleucid Empire narrative explores the final stages of the dynasty's decline, the disintegration of imperial authority, and the long-term consequences of its collapse, situating these developments within both local and regional contexts while examining the broader lessons of Hellenistic imperialism. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire faced pressures that no amount of political skill could fully contain. Internally, dynastic instability, succession disputes, and recurrent civil wars sapped the coherence of central authority. Kings frequently ascended the throne as minors, regents, or powerful ministers exerted disproportionate influence, and rival claimants often leveraged both local discontent and foreign alliances to challenge the reigning monarch. This created cycles of rebellion and reassertion, in which territories and resources changed hands repeatedly, leaving provincial populations caught between competing centers of power. At the same time, the empire's geographic vastness, stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the highlands of Iran, presented persistent administrative and logistical challenges. Communication across hundreds of miles relied on roads, rivers, and relay systems that could not always sustain rapid military or fiscal response, meaning that local rulers and satraps often exercised near-autonomous authority. While this flexibility had allowed the Seleucids to govern a culturally diverse population, it increasingly undermined cohesion as imperial authority weakened. External pressures compounded these internal vulnerabilities. The rise of Rome as a Mediterranean superpower imposed a new order that the Seleucids could neither resist nor fully accommodate. Roman interventions in succession disputes, combined with formal treaties and diplomatic supervision, effectively curtailed Seleucid sovereignty in the Western territories, especially in Anatolia and Syria. Simultaneously, Parthia in the east emerged as a dynamic regional power, gradually absorbing formerly Seleucid lands in Mesopotamia and Iran. The Parthian approach to governance, rooted in Iranian traditions, flexible in administration, and heavily reliant on local elites, proved highly effective, eroding Seleucid influence and demonstrating the empire's inability to project sustained power across its eastern provinces. The loss of eastern territories was not merely territorial. It struck at the ideological core of Seleucid kingship. By relinquishing control over lands once associated with Alexander's conquests, the Seleucid rulers undermined the symbolic universality of their authority. Titles such as Great or Epiphanes carried less resonance when the empire could no longer claim dominion over the lands of Persia or beyond. Similarly, the military's diminished capacity, increasingly reliant on mercenaries and local levies, weakened the physical basis for the projection of royal power, reinforcing the perception that Seleucid rule was in decline. Within the surviving western provinces, tensions between Greek settlers and indigenous populations also intensified. Cities continued to function as centers of Hellenistic culture, yet their loyalties were fragile, often influenced by economic interest, local traditions, and the relative strength of competing powers. In Judea, the imposition of Hellenistic norms under Antiochus IV had provoked revolt, illustrating the limits of ideological coercion and foreshadowing the empire's vulnerability to cultural resistance. Across Syria and coastal territories, civic elites negotiated constantly with the crown, balancing the privileges and autonomy that had long allowed urban prosperity against the demands of a weakening state. Economically, the Seleucid Empire faced significant strain during its final decades. Military campaigns to recover lost territories or assert dynastic claims were expensive, requiring coinage, manpower, and supplies that increasingly exceeded available resources. Taxation pressure on rural populations fueled resentment, while trade networks, though resilient, suffered from instability and competition from rising powers. Despite these challenges, Seleucid cities remained important nodes of commerce and culture, sustaining economic activity even as imperial revenues declined, demonstrating the enduring legacy of infrastructure and connectivity established by earlier rulers. The final years of the dynasty were marked by dramatic succession crises and external interventions. Rival claimants, often backed by Rome, Egypt, or local elites, contested the throne repeatedly, producing a sequence of short-lived reigns, usurpations, and assassinations. These conflicts further fragmented the empire, as provinces shifted allegiance based on the perceived strength of contenders, and as military commanders or governors carved out quasi-independent domains. Even as dynastic authority unraveled, the Seleucid monarchy retained symbolic weight, with kings continuing to issue coinage, sponsor temples, and perform ritual duties, highlighting the persistent ideological resonance of the institution even as its material power waned. Ultimately, the Seleucid Empire ceased to function as a cohesive political entity in the mid-1st century BCE, though its legacy endured. Territories formerly under Seleucid control were absorbed by Rome in the west, by Parthia in the east, and by local dynasts in intermediate regions. Yet the structures, ideas, and networks established under Seleucid rule continued to influence these successor regimes. Urban institutions, civic laws, religious practices, and trade patterns persisted, often retaining Hellenistic features adapted to new political realities. Cultural hybridity, a hallmark of Seleucid governance, became embedded in the societies of the Near East, shaping art, architecture, and intellectual life for generations. In retrospect, the fall of the Seleucid Empire illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of Hellenistic imperialism. Its longevity was remarkable given the challenges of scale, diversity, and geopolitical competition, and its ability to integrate multiple cultures under a single framework was historically significant. Yet its dependence on personal monarchy, combined with constant external pressures and the inherent difficulties of maintaining cohesion over vast territories, made collapse all but inevitable once structural weaknesses converged with external threats. Part 12, therefore, positions the Seleucid Empire as a critical case study in the dynamics of ancient imperial rule. An ambitious and innovative state that shaped its world through military might, cultural policy, and administrative sophistication, yet whose ultimate vulnerability underscores the fragile balance between authority, legitimacy, and adaptability in pre-modern empires. The Seleucid story is not simply one of decline but of transformation. The dynasty fell, but the cities, institutions, trade networks, and cultural synthesis it fostered persisted, influencing Parthian, Roman, and later societies, and leaving an enduring imprint on the history of the Near East. In conclusion, the Seleucid Empire exemplifies the challenges of ruling diverse populations across vast spaces, the interplay between ideology and power, and the ways in which imperial legacies outlast political structures. Its rise and fall illuminate the complexities of the Hellenistic world, demonstrating how conquest, governance, culture, and memory intertwine to produce both enduring achievements and eventual decline, offering timeless lessons for the study of empire, identity, and the human capacity to shape and sustain political communities across time and space. Part 13 of the Seleucid Empire narrative examines the broader legacy of the dynasty in shaping the political, cultural, and intellectual contours of the Hellenistic and Near Eastern world, tracing how the Seleucid experiment in empire building influenced subsequent states, ideologies, and societies long after the dynasty itself had vanished. The Seleucid Empire, born from the partition of Alexander the Great's conquests, represented one of the most ambitious attempts in antiquity to govern a territory of immense geographic, cultural, and economic diversity. Its rulers faced the unprecedented challenge of maintaining authority over lands stretching from the Mediterranean coast across Mesopotamia, Iran, and into Central Asia, encompassing multiple linguistic, religious, and ethnic communities. To succeed in such a context, Seleucid kings employed a combination of military power, administrative innovation, and cultural diplomacy, developing strategies that would reverberate through the centuries. One of the most enduring aspects of Seleucid influence was the creation and dissemination of Hellenistic urban culture. The foundation of new cities, often named after kings or royal family members, served as instruments of both administrative control and cultural integration. Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Laodicea, and other urban centers were meticulously planned, featuring marketplaces, theaters, temples, and civic buildings that mirrored Greek civic ideals while accommodating local traditions. These cities became focal points of cultural synthesis, where Greek language, art, and institutions coexisted with Mesopotamian, Persian, and Semitic practices. This urban model not only facilitated governance and economic exchange, but also created enduring centers of learning, craftsmanship, and religious practice that persisted under subsequent regimes. Seleucid administrative innovations further strengthened the empire's influence. While the dynasty did not establish a rigid, centralized bureaucracy, it relied on a combination of satrapal governance, local elites, and standardized legal and fiscal frameworks to maintain cohesion. Satraps, governors, and city councils exercised varying degrees of autonomy, reflecting a pragmatic approach to ruling a heterogeneous realm. Standardized coinage, inscriptions, and communication networks reinforced royal authority and facilitated commerce, creating a material and symbolic infrastructure that connected distant regions and underscored the legitimacy of the monarchy. These administrative frameworks were influential for subsequent powers, including Parthian and Roman rulers, who adapted Seleucid models to govern similarly complex territories. Trade and economic integration were central to the Seleucid Empire's lasting impact. The dynasty maintained and expanded networks linking the Mediterranean with the interior of the Near East and Central Asia. Caravan routes, river transport, and maritime connections enabled the exchange of spices, textiles, metals, and luxury goods, fostering economic interdependence across regions. Seleucid policies, such as the protection of trade routes, the establishment of ports, and the support of urban markets, strengthened the empire's role as a mediator between East and West. These economic systems persisted beyond Seleucid control, forming the basis for commercial activity under Parthian and later Roman rule, and highlighting the empire's role in shaping the material connectivity of Eurasia. Cultural and intellectual exchange flourished under Seleucid rule, particularly through the movement of scholars, artisans, and texts. Greek, Mesopotamian, Iranian, and Semitic knowledge intersected in urban centers, producing innovations in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, literature, and philosophy. Libraries, temples, and schools facilitated these exchanges, while royal patronage provided incentives for intellectual activity. The blending of traditions under the Seleucids contributed to the development of a cosmopolitan Hellenistic culture that influenced subsequent societies, providing both the frameworks and the inspiration for enduring intellectual achievements. The Seleucid approach to religion exemplifies the dynasty's sophisticated engagement with diversity. While Hellenization efforts, such as those implemented by Antiochus IV, provoked resistance in regions like Judea, the broader Seleucid strategy often combined support for Greek cults with respect for local religious practices. Temples were endowed, priesthoods recognized, and festivals celebrated, embedding royal authority within the spiritual and social fabric of diverse communities. This model of negotiated religious legitimacy informed the strategies of later empires, demonstrating the effectiveness of cultural accommodation as a tool for governance. Politically, the Seleucid Empire offered lessons in both the possibilities and limitations of personal monarchy. The dynasty's reliance on the authority of the king, rather than institutionalized governance, created remarkable flexibility, but also inherent vulnerability. When rulers were capable, ambitious, and charismatic, the empire could expand, consolidate, and innovate. When leadership faltered, succession crises and regional fragmentation were inevitable. This dynamic illustrates a fundamental tension in pre-modern empires: the balance between centralized authority and local autonomy, between symbolic legitimacy and practical administration. The Seleucid experience highlighted the necessity of adaptability and negotiation in managing diverse populations and complex territories. Militarily, the Seleucid Empire pioneered strategies and techniques that influenced successor states. The integration of Greek phalanxes, cavalry, and war elephants, combined with the use of fortified cities and regional garrisons, demonstrated a flexible approach to both offense and defense. Military organization, combined with the strategic deployment of mercenaries and local levies, enabled the empire to confront multiple external threats simultaneously, from Ptolemaic Egypt in the west to emerging Parthian powers in the east. Though ultimately insufficient to prevent decline, these military innovations were studied, adapted, and employed by later Hellenistic and Roman forces, extending Seleucid influence beyond the lifespan of the dynasty. The legacy of Seleucid diplomacy further shaped the ancient world. Kings maintained a complex web of alliances, marriages, treaties, and hostages to stabilize borders and secure influence over key regions. The Seleucid practice of leveraging diplomacy in tandem with military power provided a model for later states confronting multi-regional challenges. Relations with Rome, Ptolemaic Egypt, and regional satrapies illustrate both the potential and the limits of such strategies, showing how skillful negotiation could sustain authority even under pressure, but also how external intervention could accelerate fragmentation when structural weaknesses were exposed. Even after the formal collapse of Seleucid political authority in the 1st century BCE, the imprint of the dynasty remained evident. Parthian rulers retained many administrative, urban, and cultural practices established under Seleucid auspices, while Roman officials in the eastern provinces inherited cities, road networks, and commercial systems created or maintained by the Seleucids. Hellenistic cultural forms, including art, coinage, language, and religious synthesis, continued to shape social and intellectual life, demonstrating that the empire's influence extended far beyond the lifespan of its political institutions. Part 13, therefore, positions the Seleucid Empire as a formative and transformative force in the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. Its achievements in urban development, administrative innovation, economic integration, cultural synthesis, and ideological construction created durable patterns that influenced subsequent empires and societies. The Seleucid experience illustrates the complexities of ruling across space and diversity, the interplay of force, diplomacy, and ideology, and the ways in which imperial legacies outlast the political entities that produced them. In the final analysis, the Seleucid Empire stands as a testament to the possibilities of Hellenistic imperialism. an ambitious, adaptive, and often fragile experiment that reshaped the ancient world, leaving enduring traces in culture, economy, governance, and intellectual life that continued to resonate for centuries after the dynasty itself had disappeared, confirming the Seleucids' place among the most consequential architects of the post-Alexandrian era. Part 14 of the Seleucid Empire narrative examines the complex interplay between identity, culture, and power that defined the Seleucid world, highlighting how the dynasty's policies and practices shaped not only political structures, but also social and cultural consciousness across its territories. Unlike other Hellenistic kingdoms with more geographically compact realms, the Seleucid Empire encompassed an extraordinary diversity of peoples, languages, and traditions, stretching from the Mediterranean coastlines through Mesopotamia and Persia to the fringes of Central Asia. This diversity required a careful balancing act. The empire's rulers needed to assert authority and project legitimacy while accommodating local customs, religious practices, and elite privileges. From the outset, Seleucid kings framed their authority as both a continuation of Alexander the Great's legacy and an adaptation to the unique realities of their eastern dominions. Titles such as Soter, Epiphanes, and Megas were not mere honorifics but deliberate signals of divine favor, heroic virtue, and universal sovereignty, intended to resonate across Greek, Semitic, and Iranian audiences alike. These royal epithets were reinforced through material culture. Coinage depicting youthful, idealized portraits of kings circulated widely, projecting an image of vigor, legitimacy, and divine sanction. Coins, inscriptions, and monumental architecture became tools of ideological communication, ensuring that subjects, even in distant provinces, encountered the king's authority as a visible, tangible reality. Central to Seleucid governance was the dual strategy of urban development and administrative flexibility. Cities served as both administrative hubs and centers of cultural life, hosting councils, magistrates, religious institutions, and markets. Greek settlers and local populations inhabited these urban spaces, producing hybrid cultural expressions in architecture, art, and ritual. Satraps and local governors exercised considerable autonomy, yet they operated within frameworks established by the monarchy, including standardized taxation, law, and coinage, which linked diverse regions to the imperial center. This combination of local autonomy and centralized oversight allowed the Seleucids to govern effectively over vast distances while preserving the loyalty of regional elites. Religion played a particularly significant role in consolidating Seleucid authority. Kings patronized Greek cults and temples, yet also engaged with indigenous religious institutions, recognizing that alignment with local sacred traditions could bolster political legitimacy. Antiochus, IV's infamous attempts at Hellenization in Judea illustrate both the potential and the limits of cultural imposition. Resistance in Judea demonstrated that coercive religious policies could undermine loyalty and provoke long-term unrest. In contrast, more accommodating policies elsewhere, such as endowing temples, confirming priestly privileges, and participating in local rituals, strengthened royal authority and fostered a sense of shared interest between the monarchy and diverse communities. Military organization remained a cornerstone of Seleucid power, both practically and symbolically. The army combined traditional Greek phalanxes with cavalry, elephants, and mercenary forces drawn from across the empire's territories, reflecting the diversity of the population and the geographic challenges of frontier defense. Strategic fortresses, garrisoned cities, and mobile field armies allowed Seleucid kings to respond to internal revolts, border incursions, and rival dynastic claims. Military campaigns were also instruments of propaganda. Victories were celebrated through monuments, inscriptions, and coinage, reinforcing the king's image as a divinely sanctioned protector of order and prosperity. Diplomacy complemented military power as a crucial mechanism for maintaining control. Alliances with neighboring kingdoms, marriages into other dynasties, treaties, and the strategic use of hostages allowed the Seleucid rulers to stabilize borders and influence distant territories without constant warfare. Relations with the Ptolemies, Rome, and local dynasts illustrate the complexity of Hellenistic diplomacy, in which negotiation, coercion, and symbolic displays of authority were equally important. The empire's ability to manage multiple fronts diplomatically often determined its survival as much as battlefield success. Economic integration was another enduring legacy of Seleucid rule. Trade networks linking the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia facilitated the movement of goods, people, and ideas, while standardized coinage and city-based marketplaces ensured commercial efficiency. Urban centers became hubs for artisans, merchants, and scholars, creating a vibrant economic ecosystem that supported both local prosperity and imperial revenues. Even as the Seleucid Empire contracted politically, these economic networks persisted, sustaining regional wealth and enabling successor powers such as Parthia and Rome to capitalize on the infrastructure established under Seleucid auspices. Education, scholarship, and cultural exchange flourished in this environment of connectivity. Greek language and literature spread widely, yet they coexisted with local intellectual traditions in astronomy, medicine, law, and philosophy. Scholars traveled across the empire, transmitting knowledge and fostering intercultural dialogue, while libraries, temples, and civic institutions facilitated both preservation and innovation. The Seleucid approach to culture was therefore not homogenizing, but hybridizing, producing a cosmopolitan Hellenistic world that integrated elements from Greece, Mesopotamia, Iran, and the Levant. The long-term consequences of these policies became particularly evident after the political decline of the dynasty. By the mid-1st century BCE, the Seleucid Empire had lost much of its eastern territories to Parthia, while Roman intervention in the west curtailed authority over Syria and Anatolia. Yet the infrastructure, institutions, and cultural norms established under Seleucid rule endured. Parthian rulers retained many urban, administrative, and symbolic practices, while Hellenistic cities and trade networks continued to function under Roman supervision. Art, architecture, coinage, and civic culture maintained a recognizable Seleucid imprint, demonstrating that the dynasty's influence transcended its temporal and territorial limits. Part 14 also reflects on the Seleucid experience as a study in the dynamics of imperial identity. The empire's rulers constantly negotiated between universality and particularity, asserting overarching authority while accommodating local diversity. The resulting hybrid identity was both a source of strength, allowing governance across vast, culturally heterogeneous territories, and a source of fragility, as contested successions, external pressures, and regional rebellions exposed the limits of a system dependent on personal monarchy and symbolic legitimacy. In this sense, the Seleucid Empire illustrates the enduring tension in empire building between centralized authority and local autonomy, between ideological projection and practical administration. Ultimately, the Seleucid Empire's significance lies not merely in the longevity of its political power, but in the enduring patterns it established. The integration of Greek and Near Eastern cultural forms, the development of urban networks, the creation of economic and administrative systems capable of spanning continents, and the cultivation of ideological legitimacy that could resonate across diverse populations. Even after the dynasty's collapse, these achievements shaped subsequent empires, influenced social and cultural practices, and facilitated intellectual and commercial exchange. Part 14, therefore, positions the Seleucid Empire as a formative Hellenistic force whose influence extended well beyond its temporal existence, offering lessons in governance, cultural negotiation, and imperial resilience. The Seleucid experience underscores how empires leave legacies that persist in institutions, cities, and cultural consciousness, reminding us that the measure of an empire lies as much in the structures and ideas it transmits as in the duration of its political dominance, and affirming the Seleucid dynasty's enduring place in the history of the ancient world. Part 15 of the Seleucid Empire series examines the enduring lessons, historical significance, and long-term consequences of Seleucid rule, reflecting on the ways in which this ambitious Hellenistic dynasty shaped political, cultural, economic, and intellectual landscapes across the Near East and beyond. From its inception in the wake of Alexander the Great's death, the Seleucid Empire sought to unify vast, culturally diverse territories under a single political and ideological framework. Stretching from the Mediterranean coast of Syria through Mesopotamia, Iran, and at times into Central Asia, the empire represented one of antiquity's most audacious experiments in imperial governance. Its rulers were tasked with balancing the demands of centralized authority against the practical realities of local autonomy, the expectations of Greek settlers against the traditions of indigenous populations, and the pressures of external rivals against internal administrative challenges. The Seleucid kings demonstrated remarkable adaptability in managing these competing demands. By founding new cities and reorganizing older urban centers, they created administrative and economic hubs that served as instruments of governance, culture, and identity. Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Laodicea, and other major settlements combined Greek civic models with local architectural and religious forms, fostering hybrid cultural spaces where multiple traditions intersected. These urban centers were not merely administrative conveniences, but tangible expressions of imperial ideology, projecting the authority, sophistication, and cosmopolitanism of the Seleucid dynasty. Administratively, the Seleucids relied on a network of satraps, governors, and local elites, combining oversight with delegated authority in order to maintain cohesion across a vast and heterogeneous empire. Fiscal systems were standardized where feasible, coinage circulated widely, and legal codes blended Greek norms with local practices, producing a framework flexible enough to manage diversity, yet robust enough to sustain imperial objectives. These administrative innovations provided a template for later empires, including the Parthians and Romans, demonstrating the enduring influence of Seleucid governance structures even after the political authority of the dynasty waned. Military strategy remained central to Seleucid statecraft. The army integrated Greek phalanxes, cavalry units, war elephants, and mercenary forces, reflecting the empire's geographic and cultural diversity. Fortified cities and regional garrisons allowed the kings to project power across challenging terrain, respond to revolts, and defend borders against external threats. Military campaigns were often both practical and symbolic, reinforcing the king's image as a divinely sanctioned protector of order. Despite these innovations, the Seleucid military faced constant pressure from rival Hellenistic kingdoms, emerging Parthian forces, and later Roman intervention, highlighting the difficulties of sustaining centralized control over an expansive territory. Diplomacy complemented military power, serving as a crucial instrument for stabilizing the empire. Alliances, marriages, treaties, and hostages were used strategically to manage relations with neighboring kingdoms, internal elites, and potential rivals. The Seleucid approach to diplomacy demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power as relational and performative, emphasizing negotiation, prestige, and the projection of legitimacy alongside battlefield victories. The complex interplay of diplomacy and force reflected the nuanced realities of Hellenistic geopolitics, where success depended as much on perception and alliances as on martial prowess. Economically, the Seleucid Empire played a central role in connecting disparate regions through trade, infrastructure, and urban networks. Caravans traversed Mesopotamia and Persia, linking the Mediterranean with Central Asia, while ports and markets facilitated maritime and overland commerce. Standardized coinage and market regulations enhanced economic stability, enabling wealth and ideas to circulate across vast distances. These networks outlived the empire itself, underpinning the prosperity of successor states and facilitating enduring cultural and intellectual exchange. Cultural hybridity was a defining characteristic of the Seleucid world. Greek language, art, and institutions coexisted with Mesopotamian, Iranian, and Semitic traditions, producing a rich tapestry of religious, intellectual, and artistic expression. Temples, festivals, libraries, and schools became sites of intercultural synthesis, fostering scholarship in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Rather than enforcing uniformity, the Seleucids cultivated a cosmopolitan environment in which diversity became a source of resilience and creativity. Religion exemplified this balance. While Hellenization efforts occasionally provoked resistance, as in Judea under Antiochus IV, the broader strategy of supporting local cults alongside Greek temples reinforced legitimacy and created opportunities for collaboration between kings and indigenous communities. This flexible approach to religious authority influenced subsequent empires and shaped the ways in which rulers navigated cultural pluralism. The decline of the Seleucid Empire illustrates both the fragility of dynastic rule and the resilience of institutional and cultural structures. Territorial losses to Parthia in the east, Roman encroachment in the west, and repeated internal succession crises eroded the coherence of the state. Yet the cities, trade networks, coinage, and cultural norms established under the Seleucids persisted, forming a legacy that outlasted political collapse. Successor powers adapted, and integrated these structures, ensuring that Seleucid innovations continued to shape regional development long after the dynasty disappeared. Ideologically, the Seleucid experience highlights the tension between personal monarchy and enduring institutions. Kings projected authority through titles, coinage, and ceremonial acts, relying on symbolic legitimacy to maintain loyalty across vast territories. This system provided flexibility and immediate responsiveness, but lacked the permanence of a deeply institutionalized bureaucracy. When external pressures and internal rivalries coincided with weak leadership, imperial cohesion faltered, demonstrating the delicate balance required to sustain large, diverse polities. Part 15 emphasizes that the Seleucid Empire's significance lies not solely in territorial conquest or military prowess, but in its creation of enduring frameworks for governance, culture, and economic integration. The empire's cities, trade routes, administrative systems, and hybrid cultural practices shaped the Near East for centuries, influencing Parthian, Roman, and later societies. Seleucid coinage, urban planning, artistic styles, and religious policies left tangible and intangible legacies, embedding Hellenistic culture within a broader regional context and facilitating intercultural exchange across time and space. In conclusion, the Seleucid Empire represents both the possibilities and limitations of Hellenistic imperialism. Its successes in governance, urban development, economic integration, cultural synthesis, and ideological projection demonstrate the capacity of visionary rulers to shape history across vast territories. Its vulnerabilities, dynastic instability, overextension, and external pressures, illustrate the structural challenges inherent in managing a multicultural empire. Yet even in decline, the Seleucid legacy endured, providing frameworks, institutions, and cultural patterns that influence the course of Near Eastern and Mediterranean history. Part 15 thus frames the Seleucid Empire as a transformative and enduring force, a model of adaptive governance and cultural synthesis whose imprint persisted long after the political structures of the dynasty had vanished, confirming its place as one of the most consequential and influential states of the Hellenistic world. Part 16 of the Seleucid Empire series examines the intricate processes of cultural, political, and economic transformation that the empire initiated, and traces how these processes shaped the trajectories of successor states and the broader Hellenistic world, providing a comprehensive understanding of Seleucid influence beyond mere territorial conquest. The Seleucid Empire, emerging from the division of Alexander the Great's vast dominions, was unlike any previous political entity, not simply in scale, but in the diversity of the populations it governed. The lands under Seleucid control included Greek settlers, Mesopotamians, Persians, Semitic peoples, and numerous other communities, each with its own traditions, legal systems, and religious institutions. To manage such a heterogeneous empire, Seleucid rulers implemented a flexible yet strategic governance model that combined centralized authority with delegated autonomy. Cities became instruments of administration and cultural integration, designed not only as economic and political centers, but also as symbols of royal authority and Hellenistic civilization. Urban foundations such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Laodicea were meticulously planned, featuring Greek-style theaters, temples, agoras, and civic buildings while simultaneously accommodating local architectural traditions and religious practices. These cities functioned as nodes for the dissemination of culture, administration, and economic activity, linking distant provinces to the imperial core and providing models of civic life that persisted even after Seleucid political control waned. Administratively, the empire relied on a network of satraps, governors, and local elites, balancing oversight with flexibility to ensure compliance across vast territories. While the king retained ultimate authority, regional governors were empowered to collect taxes, maintain local order, and oversee legal matters, often negotiating with indigenous elites to legitimize their authority. Fiscal policies, standardized coinage, and inscriptions reinforced cohesion, establishing material and symbolic networks that connected diverse communities to the monarchy. This system, though reliant on personal authority and prone to fragmentation during succession crises, enabled the Seleucids to maintain imperial coherence for over 2 centuries, despite continuous internal and external challenges. Military strategy remained central to the Seleucid state, both for expansion and for the maintenance of internal stability. The army integrated Greek phalanxes, cavalry, elephants, and mercenary contingents drawn from across the empire, reflecting both the geographic scope of the realm and its ethnic diversity. Strategic fortresses and garrisoned cities allowed rapid response to local unrest or external invasion, while military campaigns were often leveraged as instruments of political symbolism, projecting royal authority and reinforcing the king's image as a divinely sanctioned protector of order. Even as the empire faced repeated losses to emerging powers such as Parthia and encroaching Roman influence, these military innovations influenced subsequent Hellenistic and Near Eastern warfare, leaving a legacy that extended beyond the lifespan of the dynasty. Diplomacy complemented military power, forming a sophisticated network of alliances, marriages, and treaties aimed at stabilizing borders and managing the relationships with neighboring kingdoms, client states, and internal factions. Seleucid rulers adeptly navigated complex international dynamics, leveraging negotiation, prestige, and the projection of legitimacy to maintain influence. Relations with the Ptolemies in Egypt, Rome in the West, and local satraps in the East illustrate a political strategy that blended coercion, alliance building, and ideological assertion, highlighting the multifaceted approach necessary to govern such a heterogeneous empire. Economic integration under Seleucid rule represented one of the dynasty's most enduring achievements. The empire maintained trade networks connecting the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia, facilitating the movement of goods, ideas, and people. Urban centers functioned as commercial hubs, enabling artisans, merchants, and scholars to thrive. Standardized coinage and market regulations facilitated economic stability, while infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, and canals enhanced connectivity across the empire. These systems persisted long after Seleucid political authority had declined, sustaining commerce and urban prosperity under Parthian and Roman administrations, and illustrating the dynasty's role in shaping enduring economic patterns across the Near East. Cultural and intellectual life flourished in the Seleucid world, characterized by a dynamic blending of Greek, Mesopotamian, Iranian, and Semitic traditions. Temples, schools, libraries, and civic institutions became sites of intercultural exchange, supporting scholarship in astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and the arts. The Hellenistic cities facilitated the circulation of knowledge, while royal patronage encouraged artistic and intellectual production, resulting in a cosmopolitan culture that persisted beyond the dynasty's political collapse. Religious policy reflected the Seleucid commitment to negotiating diversity. While certain policies, particularly the Hellenization attempts of Antiochus IV in Judea, provoked resistance, The broader imperial approach combined support for Greek religious institutions with recognition and patronage of local cults. Temples were endowed, priestly privileges confirmed, and festivals celebrated under royal auspices, embedding the monarchy within the spiritual and social frameworks of the diverse populations it governed. This pragmatic integration of religion and politics provided a model for later empires seeking legitimacy across heterogeneous territories. The decline of the Seleucid Empire in the 1st century BCE was driven by both internal vulnerabilities and external pressures. Succession disputes, civil wars, and provincial fragmentation weakened the monarchy, while Parthian expansion in the east and Roman intervention in the west eroded territorial control. The empire's reliance on personal monarchy, combined with geographic overextension, made it particularly susceptible to these pressures. Yet the collapse of political authority did not erase the Seleucid imprint. Cities, trade networks, cultural institutions, and administrative practices continued to function and influence successor states. Parthian rulers adopted many of the empire's urban, administrative, and military practices, while Roman authorities inherited its cities, roads, and economic systems. The Hellenistic cultural legacy, including art, architecture, coinage, and language, remained embedded within the social fabric of the Near East, demonstrating the enduring influence of the Seleucid state beyond its political demise. Part 16 emphasizes the Seleucid Empire's significance as a formative agent in the long-term development of the Near East. Its achievements in governance, economic integration, cultural synthesis, urban planning, and diplomatic strategy created durable patterns that shaped the trajectory of subsequent empires and societies. The dynasty's experience illustrates the possibilities and limitations of ruling a multi-ethnic, trans-regional empire, highlighting the balance between central authority and local autonomy, the interplay of ideology and material power, and the enduring consequences of administrative, cultural, and economic innovation. Ultimately, the Seleucid Empire represents not merely a historical state, but a transformative historical process, whose influence extended far beyond the lifespan of the dynasty. The cities it built, the trade networks it maintained, the cultural and religious policies it developed, and the administrative frameworks it established created legacies that continued to shape the Hellenistic and Near Eastern worlds under Parthian, Roman, and even later Islamic rule. In reflecting upon the Seleucid experiment, one observes a dynasty that combined ambition, adaptability, and cultural sophistication, whose successes and failures illuminate fundamental dynamics of empire building in antiquity. The Seleucid story underscores that the significance of an empire lies not only in its duration or military triumphs, but in the enduring patterns of governance, culture, economy, and memory it creates. Part 16 thus concludes the series by situating the Seleucid Empire as a pivotal force in the ancient world. An ambitious, adaptive, and transformative state whose innovations and legacies continued to shape political, economic, and cultural realities for centuries, confirming the Seleucid dynasty as one of the most consequential and influential forces in the Hellenistic era and beyond. Part 17 of the Seleucid Empire series delves into the enduring transformations that the dynasty imposed upon the political, social, and cultural landscapes of the Hellenistic Near East, emphasizing the long-term ramifications of Seleucid policies, institutions, and cultural innovations. From the moment Seleucus I Nicator carved out a realm from the eastern portions of Alexander the Great's empire, the Seleucid kings confronted the challenge of uniting vast and diverse territories under a single hegemonic framework. The empire encompassed lands from Syria and the Levant across Mesopotamia and Iran to the fringes of Central Asia, incorporating Greek settlers, indigenous Semitic, Mesopotamian, and Iranian populations, as well as nomadic and semi-nomadic communities in the peripheries. Governing such heterogeneity demanded a combination of administrative sophistication, cultural diplomacy, and ideological projection. The Seleucid strategy relied heavily on the creation of cities as centers of administration, culture, and economic activity. Cities such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Laodicea, and numerous smaller settlements functioned as focal points for Hellenistic civic life, incorporating Greek architectural and civic models alongside local traditions. The urban plan was deliberate. Agoras, theaters, temples, and council halls conveyed Greek ideals of governance and civic identity, while simultaneously accommodating indigenous practices to ensure the cooperation of local elites. These cities were more than symbolic. They enabled centralized administration, tax collection, military recruitment, and cultural integration, effectively knitting together the disparate regions of the empire. The Seleucid administrative system combined centralized authority with delegated regional power. Satraps, governors, and local elites exercised significant autonomy in provincial governance, managing taxation, judicial affairs, and local defense while operating within frameworks established by the monarchy. Coinage, official decrees, inscriptions, and standardized fiscal policies reinforced cohesion across the empire, providing a tangible manifestation of royal authority even in remote provinces. This balance between autonomy and oversight was critical to maintaining control over vast distances and culturally distinct populations, though it rendered the empire vulnerable during periods of dynastic instability or succession crises. Military organization was central to both the assertion and the maintenance of Seleucid power. The army integrated Greek-style phalanxes, heavy and light cavalry, war elephants, and mercenary contingents drawn from the empire's multi-ethnic population. Fortified cities, garrisons, and strategic border posts allowed rapid deployment of forces to suppress revolts, defend against external incursions, and project authority across the empire's vast frontiers. Military victories were often commemorated through monuments, coinage, and inscriptions, reinforcing the king's image as divinely sanctioned protector of order. Yet despite these innovations, military pressure from emerging Parthian forces, repeated conflicts with the Ptolemaic dynasty, and encroachment by Rome gradually eroded Seleucid territorial control, demonstrating the limits of even sophisticated military structures in the face of sustained external and internal challenges. Diplomacy functioned as an equally important tool of Seleucid strategy. Alliances, dynastic marriages, treaties, and the calculated use of hostages allowed the Seleucid kings to manage relationships with rival Hellenistic kingdoms, emerging powers, and subordinate territories. Such diplomatic maneuvers were integral to balancing power across multiple fronts, mitigating threats, and preserving the appearance of legitimacy. Relations with Rome illustrate this balance acutely. The Seleucids engaged with the rising Mediterranean superpower through negotiation, war, and strategic concessions, underscoring the complex interplay between autonomy and submission in Hellenistic statecraft. Economic integration was another cornerstone of Seleucid rule. The dynasty maintained trade routes linking the Mediterranean with Mesopotamia, Iran, and Central Asia, facilitating the flow of goods, currency, and ideas across vast distances. Standardized coinage, urban markets, and well-maintained roads supported commercial activity, while ports and river networks enhanced maritime and inland trade. Urban centers became hubs of craftsmanship, scholarship, and economic specialization, sustaining local prosperity and contributing to imperial revenue. These economic networks endured beyond the collapse of Seleucid political authority, forming the foundation for trade and urban development under Parthian and Roman successors. Cultural life under the Seleucids exemplified a cosmopolitan synthesis. Greek language, art, and institutional frameworks were interwoven with Mesopotamian, Iranian, and Semitic traditions, producing a dynamic Hellenistic culture that facilitated communication, intellectual exchange, and artistic innovation. Temples, schools, libraries, and civic institutions became centers for scholarship in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, reflecting the empire's commitment to knowledge and cultural production. Artistic styles blended Hellenistic realism with local motifs, creating enduring forms that influenced subsequent empires and societies. Religion remained a central dimension of Seleucid governance. Kings supported Greek religious institutions while engaging with indigenous cults, embedding their authority within the spiritual life of diverse communities. The attempt to impose Hellenization in Judea under Antiochus IV revealed the potential risks of coercive cultural policies, provoking revolt and long-term instability. Elsewhere, a more accommodating approach allowed royal authority to be legitimized through cooperation with local priesthoods and religious practices, illustrating the strategic integration of ideology and governance. The decline of the Seleucid Empire in the 1st century BCE was driven by structural vulnerabilities, dynastic disputes, and external pressures. Recurrent succession crises, civil wars, and regional autonomy eroded central authority, while Parthian expansion in the east and Roman intervention in the west fragmented imperial control. Yet the empire's collapse did not erase its influence. Cities, trade networks, administrative structures, and cultural norms endured, continuing to shape political, economic, and social developments under Parthian and Roman administration. The persistence of Hellenistic cultural practices, civic institutions, and urban models demonstrates that Seleucid achievements had lasting consequences beyond political decline. Part 17 emphasizes that the Seleucid Empire's significance lies as much in its processes as in its outcomes. The dynasty's policies fostered urbanization, economic connectivity, cultural hybridity, intellectual exchange, and administrative innovation, producing patterns of governance and social organization that influenced subsequent empires and societies. The Seleucid experience illustrates the delicate balance between centralized authority and local autonomy, between coercion and accommodation, and between military force and diplomatic negotiation. Its successes and failures offer enduring lessons about the dynamics of empire building, the management of diversity, and the projection of ideological legitimacy across vast and heterogeneous territories. In conclusion, the Seleucid Empire emerges as a transformative and enduring force in the ancient world. Its cities, trade networks, administrative systems, cultural practices, and intellectual traditions continued to shape the Near East for centuries, even after the dynasty's political demise. The empire represents a model of adaptive, cosmopolitan governance that balanced ambition with pragmatism, demonstrating both the possibilities and limits of Hellenistic imperial rule. Part 17 thus situates the Seleucid dynasty not merely as a historical polity that rose and fell, but as a formative agent whose legacies in governance, culture, economy, and knowledge profoundly influenced the trajectory of the Hellenistic world and left an enduring imprint on subsequent civilizations, confirming the Seleucid Empire's place among the most consequential and influential forces in the post-Alexandrian era. Part 18 of the Seleucid Empire series explores the final phases of the dynasty, emphasizing the interplay between internal fragmentation, external pressures, and enduring legacies that define the Seleucid experience and shaped the subsequent history of the Near East. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the empire faced mounting challenges on multiple fronts. Internally, dynastic disputes, regional autonomy, and revolts eroded centralized authority, while externally, the rise of new powers such as the Parthians in the east and Rome in the west placed unprecedented pressure on Seleucid rulers. The eastern satrapies, including Media, Persis, and Bactria, increasingly resisted central control, asserting local authority and, in some cases, declaring independence. These rebellions were facilitated by the empire's geographic vastness, the difficulty of rapid communication, and the reliance on personal loyalty to the king rather than deeply institutionalized governance structures. The weakening of central authority created a cascading effect, encouraging other provinces to assert autonomy and inviting foreign intervention in regional disputes. Military pressures compounded these internal weaknesses. Parthian expansion in the east gradually claimed Seleucid territories, culminating in the loss of Mesopotamian and Iranian lands that had been integral to imperial revenue and strategic defense. In the west, repeated confrontations with Ptolemaic Egypt drained resources, while Roman expansion increasingly shaped political possibilities in Syria and Anatolia. The Seleucid military, though historically sophisticated, faced challenges in recruitment, supply, and cohesion. Reliance on mercenaries, war elephants, and multi-ethnic contingents, while effective in some campaigns, proved insufficient to counter the combined pressures of internal revolt and external invasion. Military defeats eroded the perception of royal authority, undermining the symbolic legitimacy that had historically bolstered the king's power across diverse populations. Diplomacy became both a necessity and a precarious tool. Seleucid rulers employed treaties, alliances, and marriages to stabilize frontiers, maintain influence over client states, and negotiate with rising powers. Engagement with Rome illustrates this duality. Diplomacy could temporarily preserve territorial integrity or political autonomy, but it also entailed concessions that gradually limited Seleucid sovereignty. Alliances with Greek city-states and remaining Hellenistic powers offered limited relief, as these partners themselves faced instability or shifting loyalties, reflecting the complex and fragile diplomatic environment of the late Hellenistic world. Despite political and military decline, economic and cultural infrastructure continued to function across the Seleucid territories. Urban centers retained their role as hubs of trade, administration, and culture, linking Mediterranean ports with inland markets and caravan routes. Standardized coinage, maintained road networks, and functioning marketplaces facilitated the continued movement of goods, people, and ideas. This economic resilience allowed successor powers, particularly the Parthians and later Roman provinces, to inherit functional urban and commercial systems, highlighting the Seleucid Empire's lasting contributions to regional connectivity and prosperity. Cultural and intellectual life remained a defining feature of the Seleucid legacy. Hellenistic language, art, architecture, and civic institutions persisted in cities, while scholarship in philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine continued to thrive. Temples, libraries, and schools served as focal points for knowledge production and cultural exchange, reflecting the hybridization of Greek and local traditions. Even as political authority waned, Seleucid cultural influence endured, shaping the social and intellectual contours of subsequent regimes and reinforcing the dynasty's role as a conduit of Hellenistic civilization in the Near East. Religion remained both a tool and a challenge for Seleucid rulers. The dynasty's approach to local cults, Greek temples, and priesthoods generally aimed at legitimizing royal authority while accommodating local sensibilities. However, tensions arising from attempts at enforced Hellenization, most famously in Judea under Antiochus IV, demonstrated the limits of coercive religious policy and its potential to provoke resistance. More flexible strategies in other regions, which combined royal patronage with recognition of local traditions, helped sustain loyalty and integrate diverse communities into the imperial framework, illustrating the strategic importance of cultural negotiation in empire building. The ultimate fragmentation of the Seleucid Empire did not erase its historical significance. By the early 1st century BCE, the dynasty retained only fragments of its former holdings, and its political authority had largely been supplanted by Parthian expansion and Roman intervention. Nevertheless, the empire's institutions, urban networks, cultural practices, and economic systems persisted, continuing to shape regional life. Cities founded under the Seleucids remained administrative and commercial centers. Trade routes facilitated ongoing economic exchange, and Hellenistic cultural forms, architecture, coinage, artistic motifs, and religious syncretism remained embedded in local societies. In this way, the Seleucid Empire left an enduring imprint that outlived its political existence, influencing both Parthian governance and Roman provincial administration. Part 18 emphasizes that the Seleucid experience offers critical insights into the dynamics of empire building, the management of cultural diversity, and the negotiation of political legitimacy. The dynasty's reliance on personal monarchy, combined with administrative innovation and strategic accommodation of local traditions, reveals both the potential and vulnerabilities inherent in governing vast, multi-ethnic territories. The interplay of military prowess, diplomatic strategy, and cultural patronage demonstrates the multifaceted tools required to sustain authority in a complex imperial landscape. Ultimately, The Seleucid Empire exemplifies the duality of Hellenistic rule. Remarkable achievements in governance, culture, and infrastructure coexisting with inherent fragilities that eventually led to political disintegration. In conclusion, Part 18 frames the Seleucid Empire as a transformative force whose legacy extended far beyond its temporal and territorial limits. Its cities, trade networks, administrative systems, military innovations, cultural and intellectual traditions, and approaches to governance provided enduring models for successor states in the Near East. The empire's hybridized culture facilitated intercultural exchange, intellectual production, and artistic innovation, while its urban and economic infrastructure continued to function under Parthian and Roman administrations. By examining both the achievements and limitations of the Seleucid dynasty, this final part of the series situates the Seleucid Empire as a pivotal agent in the Hellenistic world, one whose influence persisted for centuries, and whose innovations in governance, culture, and commerce left a lasting imprint on the historical trajectory of the Near East and the broader Mediterranean, confirming its place as one of the most consequential and influential dynasties in post-Alexandrian history. Part 19 of the Seleucid Empire series explores the enduring consequences of the dynasty's political, cultural, and economic policies, examining how the Seleucid legacy influenced subsequent states, shaped regional identities, and contributed to the broader Hellenistic and Near Eastern worlds long after the collapse of central authority. The Seleucid Empire, emerging from the partitions of Alexander the Great's conquests, represented a vast and heterogeneous political entity, stretching from the Mediterranean coast across Mesopotamia, Persia, and into Central Asia. Its rulers confronted the perennial challenge of governing territories with diverse populations, languages, religions, and traditions. To achieve cohesion, the Seleucids combined strategies of urbanization, administrative innovation, military organization, diplomacy, and cultural synthesis, creating a framework that allowed the empire to function effectively for over 2 centuries, despite persistent internal and external pressures. Cities served as the primary instruments of Seleucid governance and cultural projection. Foundations such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Laodicea, and many others were designed not only as administrative and economic centers, but also as embodiments of Hellenistic civic ideals. Greek architectural and urban planning concepts, agoras, theaters, temples, stoas, and council chambers, were implemented alongside local traditions to produce hybrid spaces that facilitated governance, economic activity, and cultural integration. Urban centers enabled the monarchy to assert authority across vast distances, link distant provinces to imperial networks, and cultivate a sense of Hellenistic identity that complemented local customs. Administratively, the Seleucid Empire balanced centralized control with delegated regional authority. Satraps, governors, and local elites managed day-to-day affairs, tax collection, and judicial matters, while adhering to overarching frameworks established by the monarchy. Standardized coinage, legal codes, and inscriptions reinforced the king's presence throughout the empire, providing tangible signs of legitimacy and facilitating coordination across multiple provinces. This flexible approach allowed for effective governance in diverse cultural and geographic contexts, though it also created vulnerabilities that became pronounced during succession crises, civil wars, and external invasions. Military organization was central to both the defense and projection of Seleucid authority. The army combined Greek phalanxes, cavalry, war elephants, and mercenary forces drawn from multiple regions of the empire, reflecting both its geographic extent and ethnic diversity. Fortified cities, strategically positioned garrisons, and mobile field armies allowed rapid responses to revolts, invasions, and regional unrest. Military campaigns also served propagandistic purposes, reinforcing royal authority and the perception of divine favor. However, sustained pressure from Parthian expansion in the east, repeated conflicts with the Ptolemies, and the encroachment of Rome in the west exposed the limitations of Seleucid military power, contributing to territorial contraction and the erosion of centralized control. Diplomacy functioned as a critical adjunct to military strategy, helping to stabilize borders, manage client states, and negotiate relationships with rival powers. The Seleucid rulers engaged in alliances, marriages, treaties, and hostage arrangements to secure their position, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of power as relational and performative. Interactions with Rome, Egypt, and local dynasts illustrate how diplomacy could temporarily preserve influence and legitimacy, even as military setbacks and internal dissent undermined authority. Economic integration was another hallmark of Seleucid administration. Trade networks connected the Mediterranean with Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia, enabling the circulation of goods, currency, and ideas across vast distances. Urban markets, standardized coinage, and infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and river ports supported sustained economic activity and facilitated interaction among diverse populations. These networks persisted beyond the collapse of the Seleucid political framework, sustaining commerce and urban life under Parthian and later Roman administration, highlighting the enduring impact of Seleucid economic innovation. Cultural and intellectual life flourished under Seleucid patronage, characterized by the blending of Greek and local traditions. Temples, schools, libraries, and civic institutions facilitated scholarship in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the arts. Artistic and architectural production reflected a synthesis of Hellenistic styles with Mesopotamian, Iranian, and Semitic motifs, producing enduring forms that influenced subsequent empires. Greek language and education spread widely, creating a cosmopolitan culture that facilitated communication, administration, and intellectual exchange, while local traditions were preserved and integrated into the broader Hellenistic milieu. Religious policy illustrated the empire's pragmatic approach to cultural integration. While coercive Hellenization, particularly under Antiochus IV in Judea, provoked resistance and instability, broader strategies emphasized patronage, accommodation, and cooperation with local cults and priesthoods. By endorsing temples, festivals, and religious privileges, the monarchy reinforced its authority and legitimacy, demonstrating the strategic importance of religion in governing a diverse and multi-ethnic empire. The eventual decline of the Seleucid Empire was precipitated by a combination of structural vulnerabilities, dynastic instability, and sustained external pressures. Recurrent succession disputes and internal revolts weakened centralized control, while Parthian expansion and Roman intervention eroded territorial sovereignty. Despite these political failures, the material and cultural legacies of the Seleucids endured. Cities, trade networks, administrative frameworks, and cultural institutions continued to function, influencing Parthian and Roman governance. Hellenistic artistic, architectural, and intellectual traditions persisted, ensuring that the cultural imprint of the Seleucid Empire remained embedded in the region. Part 19 highlights the Seleucid Empire as a case study in the possibilities and limits of Hellenistic imperial rule. The dynasty's strategies of urbanization, administrative innovation, economic integration, military organization, diplomacy, and cultural synthesis allowed the empire to govern a vast, diverse, and dynamic territory for over 2 centuries. Its successes illustrate the effectiveness of hybridized governance, the utility of flexible administration, and the potential for cultural and intellectual flourishing across multi-ethnic empires. Its vulnerabilities, particularly reliance on personal monarchy, overextension, and susceptibility to external pressure, provide insight into the structural challenges faced by large Hellenistic states. In conclusion, the Seleucid Empire's legacy extends far beyond the lifespan of the dynasty. Its urban, economic, and administrative infrastructures shaped the development of subsequent empires, while its cultural, intellectual, and religious policies facilitated the transmission of Hellenistic civilization across the Near East. By synthesizing Greek and local traditions, the Seleucids created a cosmopolitan environment that endured under Parthian and Roman rule, influencing art, scholarship, governance, and social organization for centuries. Part 19 positions the Seleucid Empire as a transformative force, demonstrating that the enduring significance of an empire lies not only in territorial conquest or military achievement, but in the institutional, cultural, and economic patterns it establishes, which continue to shape human societies long after political authority has faded, confirming the Seleucid dynasty's place as one of the most consequential and influential forces in post-Alexandrian history. Part 20 of the Seleucid Empire series examines the ultimate consolidation of the Seleucid legacy, tracing how the political, cultural, economic, and intellectual frameworks established by the dynasty continued to influence the Near East and Mediterranean long after the dynasty's political decline, and reflecting on the broader lessons of Hellenistic statecraft, governance, and cultural integration. By the early 1st century BCE, the Seleucid Empire had largely ceased to function as a unified political entity, fragmented by dynastic disputes, internal revolts, and the encroachment of emerging powers such as Parthia and Rome. Nevertheless, the structures, ideas, and cultural norms established under Seleucid rule persisted, shaping the administrative practices, urban networks, trade systems, and intellectual life of successor states. Cities, initially founded or revitalized by Seleucid rulers to serve as centers of administration, commerce, and culture, remained functional long after the dynasty's political authority waned. Urban hubs such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Laodicea, Apamea, and others continued to facilitate governance, economic exchange, and cultural production. Greek-style institutions, including civic councils, theaters, temples, and marketplaces, provided frameworks for communal organization, political negotiation, and public life that were adapted by Parthian and Roman administrators. The Seleucid emphasis on urban planning, infrastructure, and civic organization created durable models for city management, linking populations across regions and sustaining local economies. Economically, the Seleucid Empire had established extensive trade networks connecting the Mediterranean with Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia. Standardized coinage, navigable rivers, overland caravan routes, and ports facilitated commerce, enabling the flow of goods, currency, and ideas across vast distances. Markets and artisan workshops in Seleucid cities became centers of production, exchange, and innovation. Even as central authority disintegrated, these economic systems endured, supporting the prosperity of regional powers and enabling the continuity of long-distance trade, which in turn facilitated cultural and intellectual exchange. Militarily, the Seleucid legacy persisted through the strategic and organizational models they developed. While the empire's armies ultimately failed to preserve territorial integrity, their integration of Greek phalanxes, cavalry, war elephants, and multi-ethnic mercenary contingents influenced military practices in successor states. Fortified cities and garrison posts provided enduring defensive frameworks, while tactical knowledge and organizational techniques were transmitted across regions. These innovations informed Parthian, Roman, and even local military practices, demonstrating that the Seleucid influence extended beyond political survival into the practical spheres of warfare and security. Diplomacy remained an essential component of statecraft in the wake of Seleucid decline. The dynasty's emphasis on alliances, treaties, and dynastic marriages provided a model for subsequent rulers navigating the complex political landscape of the Near East. Seleucid experiences in balancing local autonomy with imperial authority, negotiating with powerful neighbors, and projecting legitimacy through both symbolic and practical means informed the strategies of later empires, particularly in contexts where multicultural populations required nuanced governance. Culturally, the Seleucid Empire exemplified a profound synthesis of Greek and local traditions. Hellenistic art, architecture, language, civic institutions, and education coexisted and interacted with Mesopotamian, Iranian, Semitic, and Central Asian practices, creating a cosmopolitan milieu that persisted long after the fall of central authority. Temples, libraries, schools, and civic institutions remained focal points for intellectual and artistic production, while Greek language and educational practices continued to influence administration, scholarship, and cultural exchange. This hybrid cultural environment fostered intellectual cross-pollination, enabling advances in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the arts, which were transmitted to subsequent generations across different political regimes. Religious policies established under Seleucid rule further illustrate the dynasty's adaptive approach to governance. While attempts at enforced Hellenization, notably in Judea under Antiochus IV, provoked resistance, broader policies of religious accommodation and patronage helped legitimize royal authority across diverse populations. Endorsement of local cults alongside Greek religious institutions created a framework for negotiating legitimacy in multicultural settings, providing a model that influenced Parthian and Roman approaches to religious administration. The decline and eventual disappearance of the Seleucid political framework highlight the structural vulnerabilities inherent in Hellenistic empires. Overextension, dependence on personal monarchy, succession crises, and the constant pressure of external rivals. Yet the material, economic, administrative, and cultural legacies of the dynasty outlived its political authority, demonstrating that the impact of an empire is measured as much by the enduring institutions and cultural practices it leaves behind as by the longevity of its political structures. Part 20 emphasizes that the Seleucid Empire's significance lies not merely in its territorial conquests or military campaigns, but in the enduring patterns of governance, urbanization, economic integration, cultural synthesis, intellectual production, and diplomatic engagement it established. The dynasty's ability to navigate diversity, integrate multiple traditions, and create adaptable administrative frameworks provides valuable insight into the dynamics of empire building and the management of multi-ethnic states. By blending Greek and local institutions, encouraging intellectual and artistic activity, and sustaining economic networks, the Seleucids created a resilient foundation that influenced regional development for centuries. In conclusion, the Seleucid Empire represents a paradigmatic case of the opportunities and limitations of Hellenistic imperial rule. Its successes in governance, urban development, economic coordination, cultural hybridity, and intellectual patronage demonstrate the transformative potential of visionary administration, while its failures, political fragmentation, territorial contraction, and dynastic instability, illustrate the inherent challenges of sustaining authority over vast, heterogeneous territories. The legacies of the Seleucid dynasty, evident in the continued operation of cities, trade networks, administrative structures, cultural practices, and intellectual traditions under Parthian and Roman successors, confirm the enduring impact of the empire. Part 20 thus frames the Seleucid Empire as a transformative historical agent whose influence extended far beyond the lifespan of its rulers, shaping political, economic, cultural, and intellectual developments in the Near East and Mediterranean for centuries, and securing its place as one of the most consequential and influential dynasties in post-Alexandrian history. Part 21 of the Seleucid Empire series explores the enduring imprint of Seleucid governance, culture, and economic networks on the subsequent history of the Near East and the Mediterranean, emphasizing the ways in which the dynasty's innovations, adaptations, and failures shaped the evolution of successor states and the broader Hellenistic world. By the time the Seleucid political structure had effectively collapsed in the 1st century BCE, the dynasty's influence had already extended across a range of domains: urban planning, administration, military organization, economic integration, diplomacy, cultural production, and religious policy, leaving a complex legacy that would resonate for centuries. Central to the Seleucid strategy of empire was the creation and maintenance of cities as instruments of governance, cultural assimilation, and economic coordination. Urban centers such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Laodicea, Apamea, and others were carefully designed to serve multiple purposes: administrative hubs where governors and satraps could exercise authority, centers of trade linking inland regions with Mediterranean ports, and loci for civic and cultural life. Greek-style theaters, temples, agoras, stoas, and council chambers were juxtaposed with local architectural forms and religious sites, producing a hybrid urban fabric that facilitated both administrative efficiency and cultural integration. These cities persisted even after the decline of Seleucid political power, continuing to function as commercial, religious, and administrative centers under Parthian and Roman rule, demonstrating the dynasty's enduring impact on urban development and civic organization. The Seleucid administrative system combined centralized authority with delegated regional autonomy, a model that proved both effective and vulnerable. Satraps and governors exercised substantial power in taxation, local defense, and judicial oversight, while operating under overarching legal frameworks and fiscal policies established by the monarchy. Coinage, inscriptions, and official decrees reinforced the presence of central authority across the empire, providing a sense of cohesion that transcended local differences. This balance between centralized oversight and local autonomy allowed the empire to govern diverse populations effectively, though it also created structural fragilities that became apparent during periods of dynastic instability, regional revolt, or foreign invasion. Military organization was another pillar of Seleucid statecraft, reflecting both the geographic scale and the ethnic diversity of the empire. The army incorporated Greek phalanxes, heavy and light cavalry, war elephants, and mercenary contingents drawn from multiple regions, enabling flexible responses to both external threats and internal unrest. Strategic fortifications, garrisoned cities, and mobile field forces allowed the monarchy to project power across the empire, while military campaigns served symbolic functions, reinforcing royal authority and the perception of divine sanction. Nevertheless, sustained pressure from Parthian forces in the east, repeated conflicts with Ptolemaic Egypt, and the encroachment of Rome highlighted the limitations of even the most sophisticated military strategies in the face of continuous external and internal challenges. Diplomacy complemented military organization, forming a central component of Seleucid statecraft. Alliances, treaties, dynastic marriages, and hostage exchanges allowed the Seleucid kings to negotiate complex political landscapes, manage relationships with rival Hellenistic kingdoms, and maintain influence over client states. Engagements with Rome illustrate the duality of diplomacy. It could preserve territorial integrity or political legitimacy temporarily, yet it also entailed concessions that gradually diminished sovereignty. Diplomatic strategies reflected an acute understanding of power as relational, performative, and contingent, and provided models for subsequent Hellenistic, Parthian, and Roman rulers navigating multi-ethnic, fragmented political environments. Economic integration under Seleucid rule was both a practical necessity and a tool of cohesion. Trade networks extended from the Mediterranean through Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia, linking urban markets, ports, caravan routes, and inland production centers. Standardized coinage, regulated marketplaces, and well-maintained infrastructure facilitated commercial activity and enabled the circulation of goods, people, and ideas. Urban centers became hubs for artisans, merchants, and scholars, sustaining economic vitality while reinforcing connections between regions. These networks persisted even after the collapse of central authority, sustaining trade and urban prosperity under Parthian and Roman administrations, and exemplifying the dynasty's enduring influence on regional economic systems. Cultural and intellectual life under the Seleucids exemplified hybridization and cosmopolitanism. Hellenistic artistic, architectural, and educational practices were blended with local traditions, creating a rich environment for scholarship, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and the visual and performing arts. Temples, schools, and libraries served as centers of learning, while Greek language and civic institutions facilitated administration, communication, and cultural cohesion. This fusion of traditions produced enduring forms of artistic expression and intellectual inquiry, which were transmitted to successive empires and contributed to the continuity of Hellenistic culture in the Near East. Religious policy further illustrates the Seleucid approach to managing diversity. While efforts at enforced Hellenization, most notably under Antiochus IV in Judea, provoked revolt and demonstrated the risks of coercive cultural policy, more broadly the dynasty pursued strategies of accommodation and patronage. Royal support for Greek temples alongside recognition of local cults and priesthoods enabled the monarchy to assert authority while respecting existing social and religious structures, reinforcing legitimacy and maintaining loyalty across culturally heterogeneous populations. The decline of Seleucid political authority was shaped by a combination of structural vulnerabilities and external pressures. Dynastic disputes, internal revolts, and regional autonomy weakened central control, while Parthian expansion and Roman intervention gradually eroded territorial integrity. Nevertheless, the Seleucid Empire's urban, administrative, economic, and cultural infrastructures survived, influencing the governance, social organization, and intellectual life of successor states. Cities continued to function as centers of administration and commerce. Trade networks sustained economic exchange. Greek language, art, and civic institutions persisted, and intellectual and artistic production remained active, demonstrating the durability of the Seleucid legacy. Part 21 underscores the dual nature of Seleucid influence. While the empire ultimately failed politically, its contributions to urban planning, administration, economic integration, cultural synthesis, military organization, diplomacy, and intellectual life had long-lasting effects. The Seleucid model of governance, balancing centralized authority with regional autonomy, integrating diverse populations, and leveraging both coercion and accommodation, provided a framework for managing heterogeneous empires. Cultural and intellectual hybridization facilitated cross-regional exchange, preserved knowledge, and enriched artistic traditions. Economic and infrastructural systems ensured connectivity, trade, and urban vitality. Even military innovations influenced successor states, reflecting the enduring practical impact of Seleucid policies. In conclusion, the Seleucid Empire represents a transformative force in the Hellenistic Near East, whose significance extends beyond territorial conquest or political longevity. Its strategies of urbanization, governance, cultural integration, economic coordination, and intellectual patronage created patterns that shaped subsequent empires and societies, sustaining Hellenistic influence for centuries. Part 21 frames the Seleucid dynasty as both an instructive example of the possibilities and vulnerabilities inherent in empire building, and as a foundational agent whose legacies in administration, culture, economy, and knowledge continued to shape the Near East and the Mediterranean long after the political structures of the dynasty had vanished, confirming its place as one of the most consequential and enduring forces in post-Alexandrian history. The final part of the Seleucid Empire series presents a comprehensive reflection on the dynasty's historical trajectory, its enduring influence on the Near East, and its lasting legacies in political, cultural, economic, and intellectual spheres, framing the Seleucid experience as both a cautionary tale of imperial fragility and a model of adaptive governance and cultural synthesis. From its inception in the wake of Alexander the Great's death, the Seleucid Empire represented one of the largest and most diverse Hellenistic realms, encompassing territories from the eastern Mediterranean coast through Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, and stretching into the fringes of Central Asia. Governing such an expanse required a combination of military strength, administrative sophistication, urbanization, diplomacy, and cultural integration, all of which the Seleucid kings deployed with varying degrees of success. The dynasty's political structure relied on the delicate balance between centralized monarchical authority and regional autonomy. Satraps, governors, and local elites were empowered to manage taxation, judicial matters, and defense within provincial territories, operating under the broader legal and fiscal frameworks set by the king. This system allowed the monarchy to project authority across vast and culturally heterogeneous regions while accommodating local traditions and social structures. The flexibility inherent in this arrangement contributed to the empire's durability, but also created vulnerabilities. Periods of dynastic instability, contested succession, or weakened central oversight often precipitated revolts and territorial fragmentation. Military organization was a cornerstone of Seleucid power, combining Greek phalanxes, heavy and light cavalry, war elephants, and mercenary contingents from multiple ethnic backgrounds. Fortified cities, strategically garrisoned posts, and mobile field forces allowed rapid responses to both internal uprisings and external threats, while military campaigns served not only practical purposes, but also symbolic ones, royal legitimacy and the perception of divine sanction. However, persistent pressure from external powers, including Parthians in the east, Ptolemaic Egypt in the south, and later Rome in the west, exposed the limits of military capacity, particularly when compounded by internal dissent or regional autonomy. Urbanization represented both a political and cultural strategy for consolidating Seleucid authority. Cities such as Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Laodicea, Apamea, and others were planned as multifunctional centers, serving administrative, economic, and cultural purposes. Greek architectural elements, civic institutions, theaters, temples, and marketplaces were combined with local traditions to create hybrid urban spaces that facilitated governance, trade, and civic engagement. These cities endured long after the decline of centralized authority, becoming hubs for Parthian and Roman administration, commercial activity, and cultural life, illustrating the lasting material impact of Seleucid urban policy. Economic integration was another key instrument of empire building. Extensive trade networks connected the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia, enabling the circulation of goods, currency, and ideas. Standardized coinage, well-maintained roads, navigable rivers, and functioning markets sustained economic vitality, supported urban populations, and facilitated taxation and fiscal oversight. Economic systems established under Seleucid rule endured beyond the political lifespan of the dynasty, forming the foundation for trade and urban prosperity under successive empires, and demonstrating the lasting practical influence of Seleucid administrative and infrastructural policies. Cultural and intellectual synthesis was perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Seleucid Empire. The dynasty fostered a hybridized Hellenistic culture, blending Greek language, art, architecture, and civic institutions with local Mesopotamian, Iranian, Semitic, and Central Asian traditions. Temples, schools, libraries, and other centers of learning served as hubs for philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and the arts. Greek education and civic culture were propagated alongside local traditions, creating cosmopolitan spaces that facilitated intellectual exchange and cultural production. Artistic styles, architectural motifs, and literary forms reflected a dynamic interaction between Hellenistic and local elements, producing enduring contributions to visual culture and scholarship that influenced subsequent Parthian, Roman, and even early Islamic civilizations. Religious policy under the Seleucids illustrates the delicate balance between coercion and accommodation. While attempts at enforced Hellenization, most notably in Judea, triggered resistance and instability, broader strategies relied on patronage, integration, and negotiation with local priesthoods and cults. By endorsing Greek religious institutions alongside indigenous practices, the monarchy asserted authority while maintaining social cohesion, demonstrating the strategic importance of religious legitimacy in a multi-ethnic empire. Diplomacy complemented military and administrative strategies, enabling the Seleucid kings to negotiate alliances, treaties, and dynastic marriages to stabilize borders, manage client states, and engage with rising powers such as Rome. Diplomatic engagement reflected a sophisticated understanding of power as relational and contingent, highlighting the necessity of negotiation and flexibility in sustaining authority across a vast and diverse realm. Despite these strategies, the Seleucid Empire ultimately succumbed to the combined pressures of internal fragmentation, dynastic disputes, and external threats. By the 1st century BCE, the dynasty retained little political control, with Parthian expansion in the east and Roman intervention in the west effectively ending Seleucid sovereignty. Nevertheless, the empire's institutional, economic, urban, and cultural infrastructures endured, continuing to shape regional development under subsequent powers. The legacy of the Seleucid Empire demonstrates the complex interplay between success and fragility in Hellenistic statecraft. Its achievements, urbanization, economic networks, administrative innovation, military organization, cultural and intellectual flourishing, and diplomatic sophistication, provided enduring models for governance, civic life, and cultural integration. Its failures, political fragmentation, overextension, and vulnerability to external invasion, illustrate the inherent challenges of sustaining authority across heterogeneous and geographically vast territories. The enduring influence of the Seleucid dynasty is evident in multiple dimensions. Cities and infrastructure that persisted under Parthian and Roman rule, trade networks that facilitated continued economic activity, cultural and intellectual traditions that influenced subsequent empires, and administrative and diplomatic models that informed future statecraft. In sum, the Seleucid Empire exemplifies the dual nature of imperial endeavor, demonstrating both the transformative potential of visionary governance and the fragility inherent in managing multi-ethnic, multi-regional polities. By integrating Greek and local traditions, fostering economic and intellectual connectivity, and developing adaptable systems of administration and diplomacy, the Seleucids created patterns of governance, culture, and commerce that endured long after the demise of central authority. The dynasty's historical significance lies not merely in territorial conquest or military achievement, but in the lasting frameworks it established, frameworks that shaped the political, economic, cultural, and intellectual development of the Near East and Mediterranean for centuries. The final part of the series thus situates the Seleucid Empire as a formative agent in post-Alexandrian history, a dynasty whose legacies endured in material, institutional, cultural, and intellectual forms, confirming its place as one of the most consequential and influential Hellenistic states, and highlighting the enduring importance of strategic governance, cultural synthesis, and adaptive statecraft in the history of empires.